He laughed at her face. Not behind her back, not in a whisper passed between neighbors over a fence. Right there, in front of the entire feed store, Bram Calder looked at 18-year-old Elowen Pike standing in the dirt with her broken wheelbarrow and her dirty hands and her grief still raw in her eyes, and he laughed. "You're going to dig yourself a hole in that worthless hill," he said, loud enough for the whole street to hear, "and one day we'll find you dead at the bottom of it. Least it'll save us the trouble of digging you a proper grave." The men around him chuckled. A woman near the dry goods store turned away. Elowen didn't move, didn't flinch. She stood there with mud on her boots and her late husband's pickaxe over her shoulder, and she looked Bram Calder dead in the eye and said nothing, because she already knew something that man, with all his cattle and all his money and all his easy laughter, did not. Winter was coming, and winter doesn't care how rich you are. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who didn't bother to understand you, if you've ever been the person in the room that nobody took seriously, stay with me. Because what Elowen Pike did in the winter of 1895 didn't just save her own life. It saved the lives of the very people who laughed at her. This channel is where stories like hers finally get told the way they deserve. If that matters to you, subscribe right now and hit the bell so you never miss one. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story travels. And if you feel something by the end, hit like. It tells me this kind of storytelling is worth continuing. Now, let's go back to that hillside. The first thing you need to understand about Elowen Pike is that she was not a tragic figure. That's important, because the town of Hollowstone Crossing had already decided Shuz. They'd made up their minds the day her husband Thomas was buried, a young man barely 22, taken by fever in less than a week. And they'd reinforced that decision every time I saw Elowen afterward. A heavy woman, a young widow, no family within 300 miles, no money to speak of, no cattle, no farmland worth the name, no connections to anyone with power or influence in the valley. She had a hillside, rocky, stubborn, limestone-riddled ground that 2 previous settlers had abandoned, because nothing useful would grow in it. And she had a broken wheelbarrow, a pickaxe that had belonged to Thomas, and about $40 hid inside a flour tin. Hollowstone Crossing had already written her story. Girl comes west, girl loses husband, girl loses everything. Girl disappears or dies. That was the expected ending, and the town had already moved on to the next story. What they hadn't accounted for was Elowen. She'd grown up the daughter of a Pennsylvania coal miner. Her father hadn't taught her to read music or arrange flowers. He'd taught her how rock behaves when it's wet versus when it's dry. He'd taught her that underground air stays cool in summer and warm in winter because the earth insulates itself. He'd taught her that a mine isn't just a hole, it's a relationship with the ground you're working inside. And if you respect it, it will protect you. Thomas had loved her for her mind first, for the way she could look at a problem sideways and find an angle nobody else had considered. He'd followed her west because she'd pointed at a map and said, "That valley, the limestone ridge. If we can get there first," and he'd believed her completely. He'd been dead for 6 weeks when she drove the first pickaxe into the hillside. She didn't do it gracefully. The first swing bounced off the limestone wrong and sent a jolt of pains straight up both her arms that made her eyes water. She adjusted her grip, swung again. The second strike bit better, and a chunk of pale rock broke loose and fell at her feet. She picked it up, looked at it, set it aside, and swung again. That was September. The cottonwoods in the valley below were turning gold, and the nights were already carrying that particular cold, not brutal yet, but pointed like a warning. Elowen had been watching the sky for weeks. She'd been watching the birds too, the way they were moving earlier than usual, pushing south with a kind of urgency that made the back of her neck prickle. She'd asked old Josiah Terrell at the edge of town, a trapper who'd spent 40 winters in the mountains, what he made of it. He'd looked at her the way old men look at young women who ask questions, which is to say with mild condescension wrapped in a thin layer of patience. "Could be nothing," he said. "Could be something," she replied, paused, chewed the side of his cheek. Then he'd said, quietly, so nobody else could hear, "I've seen this sky before, 19 years back. We lost 30 head of cattle in one night, and 2 men didn't make it to the following Tuesday." Elowen had thanked him and walked directly to her hill and started digging. The chamber she planned was modest at first. Roughly 20 feet long, 10 feet wide, carved into the solid base of the limestone ridge, deep enough that 6 feet of earth would separate the ceiling from open air. She'd calculated in pencil, in the back pages of Thomas's account book, that this depth should keep the interior temperature above freezing, even if the outside dropped to 30 below. Should. She wasn't certain. That uncertainty kept her awake at night, and she was grateful for it, because certainty is what kills people in dangerous situations. It's the man who's sure the ice will hold who falls through. Progress was brutally slow. She could swing the pickaxe for about 40 minutes before her arms gave out. Then she'd haul the broken rock out in the wheelbarrow whose left wheel kept wobbling off its axle at the worst moments. Dump it. Come back. Swing for another 40 minutes. Some days she managed to extend the chamber by 2 feet. Some days she managed 8 inches. Her hands were a disaster. She'd started with blisters, graduated to calluses, and now had both at once in different places, the new blisters rising under the hardened skin like something trying to escape from underneath. She kept digging. The thing about Hollowstone Crossing was that it wasn't a cruel town. Exactly. It was a careless one. The people there had their own troubles, their own debt, their own livestock dying, their own roofs leaking, and a young widow on a useless hill simply wasn't interesting enough to worry about. They'd offer a nod when she came into town for flour or lamp oil. Mrs. Gerhardt at the seamstress had once pressed a small piece of salt pork into Elowin's hands without saying anything. And Elowin had accepted it without saying anything either, because some kindnesses only survive if you don't name them. But when it came to what she was actually doing on that hill, the digging, the hauling, the strange and persistent labor of it, the town graduated quickly from indifference to mockery. Silas Venn, who ran the general store, was the first one to actually say it to her face. He was a decent enough man in most respects, but he had the particular weakness of small-town men who mistake familiarity for intimacy, who think that because they know your name they're entitled to your private business. "Word is you're digging yourself a cave," he said one afternoon when she came in for rope and a new chisel. "Word is correct," Elowin said. He laughed, not meanly, just the reflex of someone who genuinely couldn't make sense something. "What on earth for?" "Warmth," she said in shelter. "There are men in this town who'd help you build a proper." "I don't need a proper anything," she said. "I need rope and a chisel." "How much for both?" he told her. She paid, she left. But the story spread. Of course it did. Small towns survive on stories, and a young heavy widow digging a hole in a worthless hill was better material than most. The version that circulated had her planning to live underground like an animal, which was close enough to true that she didn't bother correcting it. Then she spent most of what remained of her $40 on 12 goats. That's when it stopped being funny to people and started being concerning in the way that genuine incomprehensibility tends to concern people, not worried for you concerning, but unsettled by you concerning. Because they couldn't fit it into any story that made sense. 12 goats, most of them old, 2 of them clearly sick, all of them purchased from a man named Ferris who'd been trying to get rid of them for 2 months and couldn't find a buyer. Elowin's paid $7 total, which tells you something about the quality of those animals. She walked them back to her hillside herself, strung out on a lead line. The whole procession moving at the pace of the oldest female with one cloudy eye who seemed to have made peace with the world long ago. Elowin named her Margaret, which had been her grandmother's name, because the goat had her grandmother's particular expression of dignified exhaustion. She was moving the herd past the feed store when Bram Calder saw her. You need to understand what Bram Calder represented in Hollowstone Crossing. He wasn't simply a wealthy man. He was the wealthy man, the one whose opinion organized other opinions, whose laughter gave other people permission to laugh, whose approval was the unofficial currency of the valley. He had over 300 head of cattle on his northern pasture and a house with glass windows, actual glass, fitted and clear, not the waxed paper that most families used. Most of its windows were dark. He'd built the only fence in the county that was both straight and level, which he brought up more often than was strictly necessary. He was standing outside the feed store with 2 of his ranch hands when Elowin came past with her parade of 12 miserable goats. She saw him clock the animals, saw him look at her, saw the calculation happen behind his eyes, the arithmetic of someone who is about to say something unkind and is deciding how unkind to make it. Pike, he said. She stopped because stopping was the honest thing to do. Running would have given him something. Standing still gave him nothing. Those are the sorriest animals I've seen outside a slaughterhouse, he said. His ranch hands were already grinning, waiting. They suit me fine, Elowen said. What are you going to do with 12 sickly goats on that garbage hill of yours? He wasn't being genuinely curious. He was performing curiosity for an audience. Keep warm, she said. He looked her up and down slowly, deliberately, the kind of look designed to remind a woman that her body is being assessed and found wanting, or found excessive, or found somehow wrong. You're already got enough on you to keep warm, he said. Can't imagine you need 12 goats for that. There it was. The two hands laughed. A man passing on the far side of the street turned to look. Elowen felt the heat move up the back of her neck. She knew that heat. She'd known it her whole life in schoolrooms, in dry goods stores, at church, socials, anywhere that her body was the largest one in the room. And someone decided that made it available for comment. The heat was anger, and underneath the anger was something older and sadder, something that had been there since she was about 9 years old, and realized that the world had opinions about her before she opened her mouth. She let the heat be there, didn't chase it away, didn't give it to Bram Calder either. Each of these animals generates roughly the same warmth as a small stove, she said. Her voice was level, almost academic. 12 of them in an enclosed space will maintain a temperature above freezing, even when it's 30 below outside. They can eat scrub grass and thornbush that a cattle won't touch. They produce milk through winter, and they cost me $7 total. She paused. What did your last stove cost you? Bram blinked. He hadn't expected a lecture. He'd expected her to flinch, or to apologize, or to walk away faster. You're seriously telling me, he said, recovering, that you're going to live underground with 12 goats and call that surviving the winter? I'm telling you it'll work, she said. I'm not asking you to believe it. He laughed again, and this time it was louder, and this time it had an edge of something else. In it, not just amusement, but a kind of dismissal so complete it was almost physical, like he was erasing her from the conversation, even while she was still standing in it. Go on then, he said, waving his hand. Go play in your hole. She went, she didn't run. She walked at the same pace she always walked, which was deliberately, because Elowen had learned early that the way a woman moves in public is a kind of statement, and she had long since decided what statement she was making. The goats shuffled along behind her. Margaret, at the end of the line, glanced back at Bram Calder with her one good eye. Elowen thought she understood exactly what that goat was thinking. That night, back on the hill, she sat just as inside the entrance of the half-finished shelter and ate cold cornbread and thought about the calculation she'd made. Not the goat calculation, she was confident about that. The other calculation, the one she kept running and kept arriving at the same answer on. Something was coming. Not maybe coming. Not possibly coming. Coming the way the coal-black sky north of the valley was already different from the sky south, darker, heavier, pressing down closer to the ridge line with every passing week. The birds were gone. Josiah Terrell had gone quiet in the way old men go quiet when they know something and don't want to be wrong about it publicly. She needed 3 more weeks on the chamber. She had 2, maybe 2.5, before the ground would be too hard to work properly. She went back inside and picked up the pickaxe. It was past midnight when she stopped. Her arms had stopped feeling like arms and started feeling like 2 lengths of rope that somebody had tied to her shoulders, functional but barely. She set the tool down and lay back in the unfinished chamber, feeling the cold of the stone through her coat. The earth around her held still. That was the thing people didn't understand about underground. Not the cold, not the dark, but the stillness. Above the surface, wind moved things constantly, the world in perpetual agitation. Down here, nothing moved that she didn't move. It was the most peaceful place she'd been since Thomas died. She pressed one hand flat against the stone floor. I'm not leaving, she said, to the rock, to the hill, to whoever or whatever was listening. She meant it. 2 weeks later, the shelter was finished. Rough-edged, not pretty, the walls still showing the raw marks of the pickaxe in the limestone. She'd installed a ventilation shaft, an angled tube of salvaged pipe that she'd sealed around with packed clay to keep water out, and a heavy door made from cedar planks that she'd spent 2 days, fitting until it closed flush with the earthen frame. She moved the goats in on a Tuesday. Margaret walked in first, looked around, found a corner, lay down with the gravity of an old woman claiming her chair. The other 11 sorted themselves around her in a loose sprawl. By that evening, the temperature inside the shelter then was 11 degrees warmer than outside. By the time Elowen banked the small oil lamp and rolled herself in her blankets, it was warm enough that she'd pushed back 1 layer. She lay in the dark listening to 12 goats breathe, the slow rhythmic sound of it filling the chamber like something living, which it was. She thought about Bram Calder and his glass windows and his 300 head of cattle out in the northern pasture. She thought about what Josiah Terrell had said, "We lost 30 head in 1 night. 2 men didn't make it to the following Tuesday." She closed her eyes. Outside, somewhere far north of the valley, the sky was changing in ways that nobody in Hollowstone Crossing could see yet. But Elowen Pike could feel it, and she was already underground. The morning after she moved into the shelter, Elowen climbed back out before sunrise. Not because she had to. She'd already checked the ventilation shaft the night before, already confirmed the door seal was holding, already counted the goats twice in the dark, just to settle her own nerves. She climbed out because there was something she needed to see with her own eyes, and she needed to see it without the distraction of walls around her. She stood at the top of the ridge and looked north. The sky up there was doing something she didn't have a precise word for. It wasn't storming yet. It wasn't even fully cloudy. But there was a weight to it, a particular gray-green quality along the horizon that sat wrong, the way a bruise sits wrong on skin, the color of damage before the pain arrives. The wind was coming from that direction in irregular pulses, not a steady blow, but something that pushed and stopped and pushed again, as if it was gathering itself. She stood there for a long time. Then she went back inside, lit the oil lamp, and started making a list. This is the thing people never credit in survival stories, the boring parts. The inventory, the counting, the going through what you have, and comparing it to what you might need, and arriving at a number that is almost always smaller than you'd like. Elowen had learned this from her father, who kept a notebook for every winter that recorded not just what the family used, but when they used it and how fast it went, so that the following year he could plan better. She'd inherited both the habit and the notebook, a different one, started fresh on the first day of their journey west, its early pages full of Thomas's handwriting alongside hers, prices and distances and observations about the terrain. Now it was just her handwriting. She went through the shelter the way her father had taught her, systematically, touching everything, writing it down without optimism or pessimism. Just numbers. Flour, enough for 6 weeks at current consumption, 4 weeks if she had 2 extra people eating. Dried willow bark and grass for fire, 3 weeks, maybe less, if temperatures dropped hard. Lamp oil, 2 weeks, and that was concerning. Salt, adequate. Cornsmeal, 2 weeks. Dried beans, 5 weeks, if she was careful. She read back through the list. Then she wrote 3 words at the bottom of the page, underlined them once. Not enough oil. She'd have to go into town. She'd been avoiding town since the day with Bram Calder and the goats. Not out of shame, she was fairly certain. She'd left that exchange with more dignity than he had, but because every trip cost her time she didn't have, and money she could barely afford. The lamp oil was non-negotiable, though. The ventilation shaft kept the chamber breathable, but it also let in cold air, and without the lamp burning at least a few hours each night, the temperature would drop in ways that made her uncomfortable. The goats helped enormously, but they were not infinite heat sources. They were 12 animals doing their best. She went into Hollowstone Crossing on a Wednesday. The town looked the same as it always did. The main street, with its packed dirt surface gone hard with early frost, the storefronts with their painted signs, the smell of coal, smoke, and horse, and the particular damp wood smell of buildings that had absorbed decades of weather. People moved between buildings with purpose, collars turned up, breath showing white. She noticed, as she always did, the way people registered her presence. A flick of the eyes, a small adjustment not hostile. Most of them, just the instinctive recalibration that happens when someone who doesn't quite fit the expected image enters a space. She'd been noticing it since she was 12 years old and had stopped letting it slow her down at around 14. She went to Silas Venn's general store. He was behind the counter sorting through a box of hardware when she came in, and he looked up with the specific expression of a man who is aware he'd been part of a joke that perhaps went a bit far. "Miss Pike," he said. "Widow Pike, how are you getting on?" "Fine," she said. "I need lamp oil, as much as you have in stock." He hesitated. "That's a considerable amount to be buying all at once." "I know what I'm buying," she said pleasantly. "How much do you have?" He had 4 gallons. She bought all of it. He wrapped the cans in cloth for carrying and set them on the counter with the look of a man who wants to say something but isn't sure if it will land wrong. "Word is the weather might turn," he finally offered. "Word is correct," she said. "You should think about, some of the families are—" He stopped, started again. "The Hendersons have a root cellar they've offered to. I have my own shelter," she said. Elowen. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it surprised them both slightly. "That hill of yours, it's not. You're living in a hole in the ground." She picked up the cans. "A hole in the ground that will stay above freezing if the temperature outside drops to 30 below, she said. "The Henderson root cellar is 6 feet deep with a wood door and no ventilation. If they seal it against the cold, they'll use up the breathable air in a few hours." She looked at him. "Tell them that. It's important." He stared at her. "How do you know that?" he asked. "My father was a coal miner," she said. "Men die in sealed spaces. Tell the Hendersons to leave the door cracked or to cut a vent shaft before the weather hits." She paused. "And tell anyone else with a root cellar the same thing." She left before he could decide whether to be grateful or offended. Outside, she ran almost directly into Bram Calder. Not literally, there were about 6 feet between them when she registered who he was, but the near collision of it was enough that they both stopped. And now they were standing on the boardwalk in the thin November sunlight with 4 gallons of lamp oil between them. He looked at the cans, then at her. "Stocking up?" "Yes," she said. "Storm coming?" "Yes," she said. Something shifted in his face very briefly. There and gone, a crack in the performance of casual certainty he normally maintained. "How bad do you think?" "I think it'll be bad enough that you should move your northern cattle," she said. There it was. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out of her the way honest things sometimes do, before the more cautious part of the brain can intervene and point out all the reasons why saying the true thing might cause problems. Bram Calder looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. He looked, for just a moment, uncertain. Then the moment passed. "My cattle are fine where they are," he said. "They've wintered in that pasture before." "Not in a winter like this one," she said. "And how would you know what kind of winter this is going to be, exactly?" His voice had recovered its usual texture, not quite mocking, but close enough to it. "You've been talking to that old lunatic Terrell again?" "I've been watching the sky," she said, "and listening to people who know things. I've got a man who forecast weather for me. Studied it proper. He says we're looking at a hard cold spell, maybe 2 weeks, not unusual for the valley." "Your man is wrong," she said. Bram stared at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back slightly, and the gesture said everything. "I'm done, taking this seriously, without him having to say any of it." "You've got a lot of opinions for a woman living in a hole with 12 goats, he said. "I've got a lot of correct opinions," she said. "Whether you listen to them is your business." She walked away. The walk back to the hill took 40 minutes with the oil cans, and she stopped twice to shift the weight from one hand to the other. Her palms were going to blister again. She was aware, with a tiredness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion, that she had just told the most powerful man in the valley that he was wrong about something he cared about deeply, and that he had not listened to her. Most of its windows were dark, and that she had known before she opened her mouth that he wouldn't listen, and that she had said it anyway because not saying it would have been a kind of lie. She hoped his cattle would be fine. She didn't think they would be. She got back to the hill and restocked the shelter and the ventilation shaft and sat outside in the last half hour of pale afternoon light, with Margaret's chin on her knee, the old goat making the low sound in her throat that Elowen had come to understand meant "I'm here and I'm not leaving." "Neither am I," Elowen told her. The temperature that night dropped 7 degrees below where it had been the night before. She noted it in the account book. The next 2 weeks, she would later think, had a quality of controlled urgency that was almost like a current under still water. On the surface, she went about things methodically reinforcing the door seal with strips of rawhide she'd been saving, packing dried grass into the gaps around the ventilation shaft pipe, laying in one more trip's worth of cornmeal and dried beans. She spent 3 full days cutting and splitting a cord of cedar that she dragged up the hill, piece by piece, and stacked inside the far end of the chamber, enough to burn for 2.5 weeks, if she was careful. She was always careful. The goats had settled into a routine that she found quietly remarkable. They arranged themselves each night in a specific configuration, the younger, healthier animals in the center, the older ones at the periphery, Margaret always near the door as though she'd appointed herself some kind of sentry. Collectively, they generated enough warmth that the chamber, which Elowen had estimated would hold at 42 degrees on the coldest night, was consistently running at 48, 6 degrees. That 6 degrees felt like a gift. She kept a thermometer Thomas had brought from Pennsylvania, a glass instrument with a brass casing, one of the few things she'd managed to hold on to through the debt collection. And she checked it obsessively, morning and night, pressing it against different parts of the wall and floor to build a map in her head of where the heat moved and where the cold crept in. The weak point was the upper left corner, near where the ventilation shaft entered. She packed it twice more with clay, and the temperature in that corner came up 0.5 degree. 0.5 degree, she wrote it down. On the 14th day, old Josiah Terrell appeared on her hill. He came in the late afternoon, moving slowly the way very old people move in cold weather, not decrepit, exactly, but deliberate, every step considered. He had a wool coat that had been repaired so many times it had become a different coat entirely, assembled from the evidence of every winter he'd survived. He looked at the entrance to her shelter, the cedar door set into the hillside, almost invisible, unless you knew to look for it, for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "You're ready." "As ready as I can be," she said. "That's all anyone ever is." He crouched with some effort and looked at the door frame, ran one weathered finger along the seal. "Good. That's good work." "Sit down," she said. "I'll get you something hot." He sat on a flat rock outside the entrance, and she went in and heated water over the small iron burner she'd fitted into the corner and brought him a tin cup of willow bark tea, not because it tasted particularly good, but because it was hot, and she had it. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "I went out to the North Ridge this morning," he said, "early before light. And?" "You were right," he said it simply, without drama. "Coming." A small cold thing moved through her chest. Not she'd known, but the particular feeling of being right about a bad thing, which is nothing like the satisfaction of being right about a good thing. "How long?" 2-3 days, he said. "Maybe less." "How bad?" He looked at her over the rim of the cup. His eyes were pale, washed-out blue, the color of winter sky. "Bad enough," he said. "That's all I'll say, bad enough." She nodded. "You should go into town," he said. "Warn them." "I tried warning Calder," she said. "I don't mean Calder. I mean the families." He set down the cup. "Mrs. Hartley has 3 young children. The widow Morse is 60-some years old and alone. Families like that they need to know." Elowen was quiet for a moment. She looked out over the valley below, where the lights of Hollowstone Crossing were just beginning to show in the gathering dusk, small warm squares of gold against the gray of the buildings. She thought about how easy it would be to let those people make their own choices. She'd tried to warn the one person with the most resources to act on the warning. She wasn't responsible for the whole valley. She thought about Thomas, about the fever that had taken him, and how it had moved so fast that by the time she'd understood what was happening, there had been nothing left to do but hold his hand and stay next to him. She'd spent 6 weeks asking herself if there had been anything earlier she'd missed, any sign she hadn't acted on. "I'll go in the morning," she said. Josiah nodded. He stood slowly and handed her back the cup. "I'm going to my sister's place tonight," he said. "South end of town, her husband's got a root cellar. Tell them to leave the door cracked or cut a vent," she said. Told Sullivan the same thing. "An air gap, even a small one." He looked at her. "Right," he said, "course." A pause. "Who taught you that?" "My father," she said. "Smart man. He survived 30 years underground," she said. "He said the mine was the most honest thing he'd ever worked with. Treated it right, it kept you alive. Ignored it, it buried you." Josiah looked at the hillside around her, the cut stone, the packed earth, the almost invisible door. "Your father would be proud," he said. She didn't answer that. Some things don't need answering. He went down the hill. She watched him go, The old man's deliberate progress down the frozen slope until he reached the road and turned toward town, and the dusk swallowed him. Then she went inside and closed the door and counted her goats. 12, all present. She checked the thermometer, 49 degrees. The best it had been. She lay down in her blankets and listened to the wind. It was getting louder. She went into Hollowstone Crossing early the next morning, before most people were up. Cold hit her when she opened the door sharper than yesterday, with a particular quality that made her sinuses ache immediately. The sky had changed overnight. The strange gray-green she'd been watching on the northern horizon had moved closer, spread wider, taken on a heavier texture, like something swollen. She went to Mrs. Hartley's house, first because of the children. Ada Hartley answered the door in her robe, with sleep still on her face and a baby on her hip, and her expression when she saw Elowen was the specific blend of mild annoyance and social obligation that comes from having an unexpected caller at 6 in the morning. "Miss Pike," she said. "It's early, I know," Elowenson said. "I'm sorry, I need you to hear something." Ada Hartley was not the kind of woman who invited drama. She was practical and tired in the particular way of mothers with young children, and her practicality was her best quality and sometimes her most frustrating one. She looked at Elowen's face for a moment, really looked, the way people do when they're deciding whether to take something seriously. "Come in then," she said. Elowen came in. She stood in the small warm kitchen with its smell of wood smoke and baby, and last night's beans, and she told Ada Hartley as directly as she knew how. A significant storm was coming, likely within 2 days, temperatures that could drop to 30 below or worse, winds that could make existing structures dangerous. She needed to plan for being unable to leave the house for at least a week. She needed firewood inside, not just stacked outside. She needed water stored inside before the pipes froze. She needed food that didn't require lengthy cooking, because a fire burning continuously for a week would consume more wood than most people had on hand. Ada listened. The baby on her hip reached for Elowen's coat button and grabbed it with the absolute confidence of a creature that hasn't yet learned about property rights. "How do you know this?" "Not hostile, just measuring." "I've been watching," Elowen said, and Josiah Terrell confirmed it yesterday. Ada Hartley was quiet for a moment. She looked out her window at the strange sky. Then she looked at the baby. "All right," she said. "Thank you." It was such a simple response that Elowen almost didn't know what to do with it. She'd prepared for skepticism. Ada Hartley gave her none. "The root cellar," Elowen said. "If you use it, leave the door cracked or cut a ventilation hole. Don't seal it." "Why? Because you'll use up the air." Ada Hartley stared at her. "I didn't know that. Most people don't," Elowen said. "Now you do." She left and went to the widow Morse's house. Then to the Pettifer family, who had 6 children and a husband with a bad knee that would make snow clearing difficult. Then to old Carl Brannock, who lived alone at the edge of town and had the specific stubbornness of men who have survived many winters and believe that surviving many winters is proof they'll survive the next one. Carl Brannock told her he'd been managing winters since before she was born. "I know," she said patiently, "and I hope you'll manage this one too. But please, at least bring your wood inside tonight. Just the wood. You can think whatever you like about the rest," he grumbled. She left. She went to 8 houses in total. At 6 of them, people listened with some version of Ada Hartley's pragmatic seriousness. At 2 of them, she got variations on Carl Brannock's resistance. She did the math and decided 8 was better than 0. She did not go to Bram Calder's house. She'd said what she had to say. She was not going to stand on his porch and beg. She was walking back toward the edge of town, past the feed store, when she heard 2 men talking on the far side of the building, voices carrying around the corner with the particular clarity of cold air. "Says it's going to be catastrophic." That was a voice she didn't recognize. Some woman going around telling people to panic. "Which woman?" A second voice. "The Pike widow, the fat one who lives in the hill." She stopped walking. "Didn't she just buy out Silas's entire oil supply?" The second voice said. "Near enough. Calder thinks she's gone half crazy with the grief. Says she's been out there talking to her goats and rearranging rocks, and..." She started walking again. The voices faded behind her. She was 300 yards past the feed store before her jaw unclenched. The fat one, as if that were her name. As if her body were the most relevant fact about her. She had just spent the better part of a morning going door to door trying to save people's lives, and somewhere behind a building, two men she'd never harmed were reducing her to an adjective. She stopped at the edge of the road and stood very still for a moment. Cold was serious now. Not just sharp but purposeful, the kind of cold that gets into gaps you didn't know you had. The northern sky had moved again while she'd been making her rounds, pressing down over the ridge with a mass and darkness that made the air between her hilltop and town feel thin. Somehow, like the last of something. She made herself breathe slowly. Then she went home to her goats and her underground room and her notebook and her thermometer, and she did not cry, which she considered a reasonable achievement given the day. Most of its windows were of beans. At night, she ate more of them than she probably needed, because she was cold to her core in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, and because sometimes the only comfort available is a hot meal and the sound of 12 animals breathing. She checked the thermometer before she slept, 47 degrees inside. Outside, she could hear the wind had changed. Not louder, not yet. Different. The tone of it had shifted from the irregular probing pushes of the past 2 weeks to something steadier, lower. A note held at the bottom of a register she felt in her sternum more than she heard with her ears. She knew that sound. Her father had described it. The sound a mountain makes right before it decides it's done being patient. She blew out the lamp. She lay in the dark and listened to 12 goats settle and shift and breathe. Sleep didn't come quickly. It rarely did anymore. Her mind kept running the inventory again: oil, food, wood, ventilation, seal, thermometer, water cycling through the list with the mechanical persistence of a brain that knows danger is close and refuses to shut off. She'd filled every available container with water that afternoon. She'd packed the gap under the door with a strip of old blanket. She'd moved the youngest goat, a spindly brown male she'd named Pepper because he was irritating in the way. Pepper is irritating, closer to the center of the group. She thought about Ada Hartley's 3 children. She thought about Carl Brannick's woodpile. She thought about Bram Calder's 300 cattle in the northern pasture, exposed on open ground, and felt a helpless frustration that was not quite anger and not quite sorrow, but somewhere in between. She thought about Thomas, the way she always did in the dark, not the end of him. She'd made a deliberate choice not to live in that, but the earlier parts. The way he'd laughed at her ideas before he agreed with them. The specific sound he made when he was thinking hard. The time she'd explained the underground shelter concept to him on a train heading west, and he'd listened to all of it without interrupting, and then said, "You know what, Elle? I think you're right," with exactly the tone of someone who has just discovered something true. "I think you're right." She pressed her hand flat against the stone floor. The earth held still under her palm. Patient and solid and utterly indifferent to human concerns in the way that deep things are indifferent, not cruel, just old. She was almost asleep when the first gust hit. Not a gust that's too small a word. A surge, the kind that hits a building like something with intention, finding every weak point simultaneously. The shelter door flexed slightly in its frame. The ventilation pipe made a whistling sound she hadn't heard before. One of the goats startled awake and scrambled briefly before settling. Elowen was on her feet with the lamp lit before she'd finished waking up. She went to the door and pressed her palm against it. She could feel the pressure on the other side, not constant, pulsing, rhythmic in the way that truly serious wind pulses, finding its beat. She checked the rawhide seal. She checked the wooden crossbar she'd fitted 2 days ago. She checked the ventilation pipe where it passed through the wall. Everything holding. She allowed herself to breathe. Then the temperature outside, according to the thermometer she'd hung just outside, the door crack dropped 4 degrees in under an hour. She stood in the lamplight and looked at the number. 4 degrees in under an hour. She'd planned for 30 below as her worst case. She'd been confident that was an extreme enough margin. Now, feeling the shift in the wind's character, the new weight of it, the cold packed into it like something dense and deliberate, she found herself running the numbers again and arriving at a different answer. She thought, I may have underestimated this. For the first time since she'd driven the first pickaxe into the limestone, a thread of genuine fear moved through her. Not paralyzing, she was not a person who was easily paralyzed, but real. Cold and specific and honest in the way that real fear is. She stood with it, Then she went and stoked the small burner and put water on to heat and sat down cross-legged among the goats with Margaret's warm weight against her side. And she waited for morning in the way you wait for a thing you can't stop from coming. Outside, above 6 feet of earth and limestone, the storm broke over Hollowstone Valley, and it was nothing like what anyone had prepared for. The sound was the first thing that told her how bad it truly was. Not itself she'd been hearing the wind all night, that low sustained pressure that she'd felt in her sternum more than her ears. This was something different. Sometime around what she estimated was 4 in the morning, the character of the sound above her changed the way a river changes when it goes from fast water to a falls, not just louder, but fundamentally altered, as if the storm had shifted from one gear into another that didn't have a name yet. Things were breaking up there. She couldn't see them, but she could hear the concussive reports filtering down through 6 feet of limestone and earth-sharp sounds, irregular, scattered across the ridge above like a percussion section, playing without a conductor. Wood splintering. Something heavy rolling. Once, a sound that was lower and more final, like a structure giving up its argument with the wind all at once. She sat up in her blankets and counted goats by sound. 12. All breathing. Margaret was awake, her one good eye catching the dim glow of the lamp's lowest setting. Elwyn checked the thermometer, 46 degrees inside. She went to the door and opened it 2 inches. The cold that entered was not the cold she'd stepped out into morning, or the cold of the past 3 weeks or any cold she'd encountered since coming west. It was the kind of cold that feels like a physical object, something with mass and intention, and it came through the 2-inch gap in the door like a hand reaching in. She shut the door immediately. She stood with her back against it, breathing. In those 2 seconds, the outside thermometer she'd glimpsed had read something she couldn't fully reconcile, 22 degrees below zero, and that was at the sheltered side of the door, which faced into the hillside, away from the direct wind. Her worst-case planning number had been 30 below. She was not going to get the comfort of being right about that. Most of its windows were dark. She went to her notebook and wrote the number down because she had the habit of writing things down even when she didn't want to, especially then. When you write a thing down, you commit to the reality of it. You can't pretend you didn't see it. Then she fed the goats their morning ration of dried grass and checked the ventilation shaft. The shaft was doing what shafts do in severe weather. It was partially iced. Not blocked, there was still airflow. She could feel it when she held her palm near the interior opening, but constricted. She'd built the shaft with a slight downward angle on the outside end, specifically to prevent snow accumulation, and that had helped. But ice was a different problem from snow. Ice was patient. Ice didn't drift, it grew. She'd made the pole specifically for this. It was a cedar shaft, about 9 feet long, narrow enough to fit through the interior diameter of the ventilation pipe, with a few inches of clearance. She'd sharpened one end to a rough point and hardened it briefly over the burner flame. She had hoped she would never need to use it. She had known, at the same time, that she almost certainly would. She fitted the pole into the shaft opening and drove it upward. The first push hit resistance about 6 feet up ice, hard and thick, the pole stopping with a jolt that vibrated down into her shoulder. She pulled back and drove again, harder, again. The third strike broke something loose, and she felt the resistance give slightly, then hold again at a different point. She worked the pole in a slow circular motion, the way her father had taught her to work a stuck drill bit, not straight in and out but rotating, grinding, patient. On the 6th attempt, the blockage gave entirely. Cold, fresh air rushed down the shaft in a thin column, and she felt it against her upturned face like something precious. She stood with her arms aching and her lungs full of that sharp cold air and allowed herself 10 seconds of something that was not quite relief. It was too early for relief, but was at least a temporary retreat from the edge of panic. 10 seconds. Then she put the pole back in its place against the wall, where she could reach it in the dark. The storm above her intensified through the morning. She knew this, not by sound alone, but by something more subtle, a change in pressure that she felt in her ears, the same sensation as descending rapidly from altitude, as though the storm was pressing down on the valley with actual physical weight. The goats were unsettled in a way they hadn't been the night before. Not panicking, they were too accustomed to her presence for that, but restless, shifting. the younger ones pressing closer to the older ones in a configuration that wasn't their usual sleeping arrangement. She spent the morning doing small maintenance tasks because doing nothing was not something she was capable of. She rechecked every seal on the doorframe. She repositioned two of the supply bags that had been sitting against the wall with the worst temperature reading, moving them toward the center of the chamber. She reread the relevant pages of her notebook, the calculations, the temperature records, the inventories, not because she'd forgotten them, but because reading them felt like reinforcing something in herself. At mid-morning, she heard the first human sound. It was faint, filtered through 6 feet of earth and the noise of the storm, and she might have missed it if one of the goats hadn't lifted its head at the same moment, the particular alert posture of a prey animal that has registered something it doesn't recognize. She went still and listened. There it was again, a pounding, not the irregular impact sounds of the storm. This was rhythmic, deliberate, human. Someone was hitting her door. Her first feeling was not what she expected. It wasn't relief that someone had survived, or warmth at the thought of company. It was a fierce protective calculation. Opening that door means releasing heat I cannot easily replace. The thought was cold and specific, and she was not proud of it, but it was there, and she acknowledged it, because pretending it wasn't there would have been dishonest. Then she thought about the warmth she'd lose versus the warmth of 2 more bodies she might gain depending on their condition. Then she thought about being a person who stands behind a door listening to someone pound on it. She crossed the chamber in 4 steps and opened the door. The cold came in so fast and hard it was like a blow. And in the doorway, barely visible through the white horizontal wall of snow, were 2 shapes men, both of them moving with the desperate, clumsy urgency of people who have used most of their physical resources getting to where they are. She grabbed the closer one by the arm and pulled. He came in half falling, and the second man came in behind him, and she got the door shut. It took 3 attempts because something had frozen while it was open, and stood with her back against it, breathing hard. In the lamplight, she looked at who she'd pulled inside. Ven. She recognized him first, his face so red from cold it was almost purple, his mustache frosted completely white. He was bent forward with his hands on his knees, making the sound of a man who has been running without enough air. And behind him, on his knees on the floor of her shelter, was Bram Calder. Elowyn stared at him. He looked up at her. His face was a thing she'd never expected to see on Bram Calder, stripped bare, all the performance of confidence and casual authority gone. Just a man who had come very close to dying and knew it. There was frost in his eyebrows and ice in the color of his coat, and his hands, she noticed, were not protected. He'd lost a glove somewhere, and the uncovered hand was a color that made her chest tighten. "Get that hand warm," she said. "Don't put it near the burner." He looked at his own hand as if he'd forgotten it was attached to him. "Silas," she said more gently, "are you injured?" Silas straightened up slowly. He was shaking in the full-body way that deep cold produces, a shaking that was beyond shivering, his whole frame vibrating with it. "No," he managed. I don't think so. My feet." "Sit down," she said. "Get your boots off. I need to check your feet." "Elowyn." He said her name the same way he had in the store 2 weeks ago, with that same note of surprised intimacy, like he kept forgetting she had a given name and kept being startled by it. I'm sorry I didn't." "Sit down first," she said. "Sorry. Later." She turned to Bram. He was still on his knees, which bothered her in a specific way, not the symbolic weight of it, but the practical fact that the floor was the coldest part of the shelter. "Get up," she said. "Sit on the supply bags, not the floor. Fold the uncovered hand under your arm, against your body, not near the fire." He got up. His coordination was off the movements of someone whose body is not fully obeying, but he made it to the supply bags and sat and tucked his right hand under his left arm, and looked at her with an expression she would not have been able to name with a single word. She checked Silas's feet while he sat against the wall. His boots had kept the worst of it out, but his toes were very cold, not frostbitten. She didn't think, but close enough that she made him flex each toe individually while she watched. He hissed in pain when the circulation started returning, and she took that as a reasonable sign. "How did you get here?" she said. I was at the store," Silas said, his voice still unsteady. "Bram came in off the street maybe an hour after it hit. His horse had thrown him about a half mile out of town. He'd been walking, or trying to. She looked at Bram. You were riding in this? Bram's jaw tightened. I needed to get to the northern pasture. In 30 below wind. A pause. I didn't know it was 30 below. I told you something bad was coming. Another pause longer. The shelter was warming fractionally. She could feel it already, the addition of 2 bodies beginning to shift the thermal balance. The goats had resettled, most of them, though Pepper was eyeing Bram with the specific suspicion that young animals reserve for large, unfamiliar presences. You told me, Bram said. His voice was flat and stripped of its usual confident cadence. You're right, you told me. She hadn't expected him to say it. She'd expected defensiveness, or deflection, or the particular thing powerful men do when they've made a bad decision, which is to explain at length why the decision made sense at the time. She hadn't expected, you're right, you told me. She didn't say I know. She didn't say anything for a moment. What was the situation in town when you left? She asked Silas. He pulled his second boot back on, wincing. Bad. The Morrison barn roof came down around 6 this morning. I heard it go. The hotel lost 2 windows glass all over the front room. Dobbins' stable. He stopped. I don't know. I couldn't see more than about 10 feet in any direction. The families I spoke to, she said. The Hartleys. The Pettifers. Hartley House looked solid when I passed it, Silas said. Smoke. Coming from the chimney. The Pettifers, I don't know. She added that to the running inventory. In her head, the list she'd been keeping since the storm broke, the accounting of what she knew and what she didn't. How did you know to come here? She asked. Silas and Bram exchanged a glance that contained more information than either of them probably intended. Silas said the hill, Bram said. He said you'd built. He stopped. Looked around the shelter for the first time, really looked at it the way you look at something when you've been dismissing it as absurd for months and are now sitting inside it alive because of it. He said you'd built something that could hold. I knew about the underground principle, Silas said quietly. My grandfather wintered in a dugout in Kansas. I should have. He stopped again. He seemed to have developed a habit in the last few minutes of starting sentences and running out of road before he finished them, taking it more seriously. You're here now, Elwyn said. There was a silence in the chamber, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted, as if the 3 of them were each separately adjusting to the reality of their current arrangement. Storm outside provided a continuous low-frequency backdrop, audible even down here, the pressure of it present in the air like a held note. Bram was looking at the goats. 12, he said. 12, she confirmed. They're warmer than I expected, he said. In here. That's the point, she said. He looked at his uncovered hand. Color was improving, still pale, but no longer the alarming white-blue of the first few minutes. He flexed the fingers slowly, made a face at the sensation. The other glove is somewhere between here and the road, he said. I fell. I know, she said. I could tell from the way you came through the door. A short silence. Then unexpectedly, how? You were favoring your right side, she said, and you had ice on your left sleeve further up than your right, which means your left arm went down first. You fell on your left side, lost the glove, trying to get up, probably had to push with your bare hand against the snow. He stared at her. You figured all that out in the time it took to get the door shut? My father noticed things, she said. He said underground work teaches you to read what you can't directly see. Bram was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I need to get back out. My cattle. You cannot go back out, she said. They're dying, Elwyn. It was the first time he'd used her name. She registered it the same way she registered all unexpected things, noted it, set it aside. Every hour I'm in here is another hour there. Every minute you go back out in this is closer to you dying, she said. And you know that. You were barely upright when you came through that door. If Silas hadn't been guiding you the last stretch, would you have found the hill at all? A very long pause. No, Silas said quietly, answering for him. Bram said nothing. His jaw worked. He looked at the wall. She understood what it cost him to be still while his animals were dying. She didn't diminish it, but she also didn't move from her position. You go out in this, she said, and you'll freeze before you reach the pasture road. Then you'll be dead. Your cattle will still be dying, and 2 people will be sitting in this shelter, unable to do anything about either problem. You stay here, and when this passes, and it will pass, you'll be alive to deal with what comes after. He looked at her. You sound like you've this argument before. My father had it with himself every time there was a cave-in on a section he was responsible for, she said. He said the hardest thing about underground work isn't the danger. It's learning when going forward is brave and when it's just stupid. The word landed in the shelter and sat there. Bram exhaled slowly. He pressed his recovered hand against his face. Which did he think it was? Going forward? Depended on the situation, she said. He lived to 67, so he got the calculation right more often than not. Something changed in Bram's expression, not a smile, not anything that gentle, but a small yielding in the set of it. The stubbornness didn't leave entirely. She didn't expect it to, but it moved slightly to the side. All right, he said. I'll stay. The first few hours with 2 extra people in the shelter had a particular texture that Elowen hadn't anticipated. She'd imagined rescue scenarios in the abstract, had even planned for the possibility of extra people. She'd included a small surplus in her food calculations, nothing dramatic. Just a quiet acknowledgement that plans and reality have a complicated relationship. But she hadn't fully thought through the social dimensions of it. The specific awkwardness of being confined in a 20 by 10-foot chamber with 2 men who had, to varying degrees, dismissed her, mocked her, or failed to take her seriously. Silas seemed to sense his own position in this clearly. He was quiet in the careful way of someone managing genuine remorse, not performing it, but actually sitting with it, which is harder and less visible. He helped where he could. When one of the younger goats knocked over a water container, he righted it before she'd moved. When she checked the ventilation shaft 2 hours later and came back with stiff hands, he took the pole from her and set it back in its place against the wall without being asked. Bram was more complicated. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life being the largest presence in any room, the one people looked to, the one whose decisions set the tone. In Elowen's shelter, he was a guest whose survival depended on the preparations of a woman he'd publicly mocked. That was not a situation he had any experience navigating, and it showed. He was neither hostile nor gracious. He occupied the middle space of a man in a process he hadn't expected. She checked the thermometer every 2 hours. The numbers told the story she'd hoped to avoid. The storm was not diminishing. If anything, it was settling in the irregular surges of the early hours, smoothing into something more sustained, more confident of itself, the way a truly serious eventually stops announcing itself and simply becomes the condition of the world. Temperature outside, read through the door crack, -28. Inside, 44 degrees. She'd lost 2 degrees since they'd opened the door for Silas and Bram. Not catastrophic, but the loss of 2 bodies' worth of heat from the door being open had cost more than 2 bodies sitting in the chamber would restore quickly. She reevaluated her wood supply and recalculated the burn rate, with the burner running slightly higher than planned. You keep a lot of records, Bram said at some point in the afternoon. She was writing in the notebook. Yes, she said, without looking up. What are you writing? Temperature at 2-hour intervals. Current wood supply estimate. Food inventory with 3 people's daily requirements rather than 1. A pause. Ventilation shaft status. He was quiet. Then you plan for extra people. I planned for the possibility, she said. There's a difference. What is it? She looked up. Planning for the possibility means you have a little more than you need, but not as much as you'd have if you'd known. Planning for extra people means you'd have known how many. I didn't know how many, so I have a little more food and oil than I need for myself, and somewhat less than I'd ideally want for 3 people for an extended stay. She paused. We'll be fine. We'll need to be careful, but we'll be fine. Silas had fallen asleep against the wall, which was the best thing he could do. Sleep uses fewer calories than wakefulness and generates its own small warmth. One of the younger goats had migrated toward him and was pressed against his leg with complete animal practicality. Why did you plan for extra people at all? Bram asked. It was a genuine question. She could tell because he wasn't performing anything when he asked it, no edge, no weight behind it, just asking. She thought about it for a moment. Because I couldn't guarantee I'd be the only person who needed help, she said. And because my father, she stopped, reformulated. Because I was raised by someone who believed that preparing only for yourself is a kind of arrogance. You plan for yourself, plus whoever might end up needing what you have. Bram was quiet for a long time. The storm continued its sustained conversation with the world above them. My northern cattle, he said finally. How many do you think? Don't. she said. I need to know what I'm... You don't need to know right now, she said more firmly but not unkindly. You cannot change it from here. Calculating the loss right now just gives you something to be destroyed by while you're still alive and need to stay clear-headed. You can do that calculation when you can see the pasture. He looked at her with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of someone receiving advice they know is correct and hate for that very reason. You're right, he said, again. It was becoming a pattern. The ventilation shaft gave her the first serious problem at what she estimated was 6 in the evening. She'd been checking it every 2 hours, running the pole through on the 4th hour when she'd noticed slight resistance building. On this check, the resistance was substantial, not the hard ice blockage of the morning, but a dense packed snow that had found its way into the outer portion of the pipe, despite the downward angle. She worked the pole upward and broke through the first layer, felt a second layer above it. She broke that one too, and a third. On the 5th push, fresh air came down in a rush, and she exhaled. But when she pulled the pole back, she could hear the wind differently, a higher pitch, more direct, which told her the storm had shifted direction slightly. The outer opening of the shaft was now catching more wind than before, and wind meant faster snow accumulation. She was going to need to clear it more frequently. Can I help? Bram said from behind her. She turned. He was standing, watching her work the pole. His expression was purely practical. You'd have to lie on your back and work the pole upward at this angle, she said. It takes some me, he said. She showed him. He lay on his back, fitted the pole at the angle she demonstrated, and drove it upward on the first try, with considerably more force than she'd been using. The resistance gave faster. Stronger arms, she said flatly. More weight behind it, he said, which was factually the honest answer rather than the boastful one. She set a 2-hour rotation. She would check the thermometer and inventory while he cleared the shaft. It wasn't a conversation she'd have predicted having at the start of this day, but then very little of this day had gone as predicted. Storm held through the night. She slept in 2-hour intervals, waking at each rotation to check the thermometer and check the shaft before letting Bram take over the clearing. Silas had fully recovered and took a rotation as well, and the three of them fell into an ungraceful but functional pattern, not smoothly, not without the occasional friction of exhausted people in close quarters, but working. Around 2 in the morning, Pepper managed to knock over Elwyn's water supply, all of it, 3 containers, cascading across the floor in a flood that also soaked one of the supply bags and a corner of her blanket roll. She stood looking at the water spreading across the stone floor and felt the weight of everything she'd been holding together all day sit down on her shoulders all at once. Bram was already moving, picking up the containers, uprighting them, pulling the soaked supply bag away from the puddle. Silas had grabbed the blanket and was wringing it out against the wall. Neither of them said anything. They just moved. She watched them for a moment. Then she went and got the mop she'd made from a cedar handle and a bundle of rags she'd made it 2 weeks ago. During the final days of preparation, laughing to herself slightly at the specificity of it, a mop? Elwyn, really, and started cleaning up the water. That goat, Bram said with a precision of tone that made Silas snort. His name is Pepper, Elwyn said. He's terrible. I've known that since I bought him. Why'd you keep him? Because he was $7 total for 12 goats, and he was part of the 12, she said. You don't get to discard the difficult ones just because they're difficult. Bram picked up the last container and set it right. He looked at her. You could apply that to a lot of things, he said. Yes, she said. You could. They looked at each other across the damp floor of the underground shelter, with 12 goats between them and a storm pressing down above and the lamp flame doing its careful work in the corner. Turned back to mopping. The shaft required clearing 4 times between 2 and 6 in the morning. On the 3rd clearing, Bram came back from the rotation with a different expression on his face, tighter, concerned in a specific way. It's harder to break through than before, he said. She sat up. How much harder? The first 2 layers cleared fast. There was a 3rd that took me 6 or 7 drives, and I can feel a 4th above it when I push the pole all the way up. She was on her feet. She took the pole and tried it herself. He was right, the 4th layer was dense, packed, and higher up than anything she'd encountered before, which meant the accumulation was moving further into the pipe. She pushed harder. The pole slipped on the ice, and jarred against the pipe wall, and her wrist made a sound she hadn't meant to make. "Let me," Bram said. Not asking, just stating. She stepped aside. He took the pole and drove it with a force that was, objectively, more than she had in her. The fourth layer held. He drove again, and again. On the fifth strike she heard a crack, and on the sixth airflow returned. They both stood breathing hard in the aftermath. The lamp flame, she noticed, had been flickering for the past hour, the kind of flutter that happens when oxygen is moving in the which was good, but also when oxygen was slightly reduced, which was less good. She looked at the flame now, and something went quiet in her chest. The flame was not flickering. It was burning in a way that was too still, too low. The color of it shifted slightly toward orange in a way she hadn't seen before. She'd seen that color in her father's descriptions. Miners used candles. When the candle changed color, you had a finite amount of time. "Bram," she said, keeping her voice level. "Clear the shaft again. Right now." Now," she said, "please." Something in her voice made him move without asking why. She watched the flame while he worked. It sat at its wrong color, still and low, while above her she heard the rhythmic impact of the pole going up and up and up. Then it hit something and stopped. "There's something solid," he said. "Not ice." Something else. She crossed to him. Took the pole. Drove it upward. Solid resistance. Not the give of ice or packed snow. Something heavier, denser. A structural blockage debris from above, she thought. Something the storm had deposited or collapsed across the outer opening of the shaft. She drove the pole again. It didn't move. The lamp flame flickered once. Silas was awake now, sitting up, watching them with an expression he was working hard to keep neutral. She looked at the flame, then at the blocked pipe. "How much air do we have?" Bram said quietly. She ran the calculation fast: space volume, occupancy, current burn rate. "Enough," she said. "But not if we wait." She pulled the pole back and repositioned it. "I'm going to try a different angle. When I said push, add your weight to the top of the pole." She positioned herself at the base of the pipe, reset her grip, adjusted the angle by 15 degrees to address the blockage from a different direction. "Push," she said. Both of them drove the pole upward together. The resistance held for 3 full seconds that felt like minutes. Then, with a sound like a muffled crack, filtered through 6 feet of earth, something gave way above them. Cold air poured down the shaft in a column so strong it nearly blew the lamp out. Elwyn caught the lamp globe with both hands. The flame recovered, burned clean and bright. She sat on the floor with the lamp between her palms and breathed the cold incoming air in long, slow pulls. And above her, the storm continued its long work on the world. Most of its windows were dark, and Bram sat down beside her on the stone floor without being asked and said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. The goats breathed, the lamp burned. The earth held still. They were still alive. The storm broke on the third morning. Not dramatically, there was no sudden silence, no single moment when the noise stopped. It was more like a long exhalation, the storm's pressure gradually releasing the way a fist unclenches when the reason for making it has finally passed. The sustained low-frequency vibration that had been present in the walls of the shelter for 2 full days simply wasn't there anymore when Elwyn woke from her last 2-hour rotation. She lay still in the quiet for a moment before she trusted it. Then she looked at the thermometer. Outside temperature, -11. Still brutal, but -11 was a different world from -28. -11 was survivable in the open if you were dressed and moving. -28 was something else entirely, the kind of cold where the arithmetic of exposures stops being theoretical and starts being a countdown. She sat up slowly. Her back had developed a specific complaint in the past 40 hours, the result of sleeping on packed earth interrupted by repeated middle-of-the-night rotations to the ventilation shaft. It wasn't an injury, just a deep structural protest, the kind her body used to register events while her mind was occupied elsewhere. Silas was asleep. Bram was not. He was sitting against the far wall with his knees drawn up and his hands around the tin cup she'd given him the previous morning for willow bark tea, which he'd been refilling with water and nursing as a hand warmer long after any residual heat had given out. He looked like a man who had been awake for a while, sitting with his thoughts in the particular alone in a crowd way you can be alone even in a 20 by 10 room with 2 other people and 12 goats. He looked up when she moved. It's quieter, he said. Yes, she said. How long before we can go out? She thought about it honestly. An hour, maybe 2. I want to confirm the pressure is actually stabilizing and not just a lull. In a storm this size, there can be a false quiet between bands. He nodded. He accepted that without argument, which she noted. 3 days ago, he would have pushed back. She checked the ventilation shaft clear, clean airflow, the outside sound of wind present but distant and ordinary, nothing like the structural intensity of the past 48 hours. Then she checked her inventory. The oil had held. The food had held. Barely they'd been careful, eating half rations for the final stretch, not from crisis but from precaution. She had perhaps a day and a half of full rations remaining, which would be more than adequate if they could get out today and reach the town. She wrote the final numbers in her notebook. 2 days of records, temperature charted at 2-hour intervals, ventilation shaft status, food consumption. It looked like the logbook of a small operation, which it was, she supposed. The smallest possible operation, 3 people and 12 goats outlasting. Something that had tried very hard to be the end of things. Margaret was already at the door. The old goat had some internal barometric sense that Elowen had come to trust almost as much as the thermometer. She stood facing the cedar planks with her ears forward, and that posture said, "Outside is acceptable now." "All right," Elowen said to no one in particular. "Let's see what's left." Getting the door open required force. She'd expected this. The door frame had been under sustained cold and wind pressure for 2 days, and the rawhide seal had partially frozen to the frame on the outside edge. She put her shoulder into it, felt the resistance, put more of herself into it. Bram appeared beside her without being asked, and added his weight to the effort. And on the third push, the door swung outward and the daylight hit them both, like something physical. Elowen squinted hard against it. After 2 days of lamp flame and darkness, the reflected light off the snow was nearly blinding, a white so total and flat it eliminated shadows, made everything look two-dimensional, like a charcoal drawing that someone had erased and only left the outline. She stepped out. The cold was a full-body event, even at -11. It found every gap immediately, the gap between her collar and her hat, the gap at her wrists where her sleeves ended. She pulled her coat tighter and looked around. The landscape she stepped into was not the landscape she had prepared in. Her hillside had been resculpted. The snow wasn't a uniform blanket, it was a topography unto itself, drifted and carved by the wind into forms that bore no relationship to the ground underneath. The entrance she'd stepped through was the low point of a drift that curved 8 feet high to her right, a blue-white wave frozen mid-motion. The ridge above her had lost a section. She couldn't immediately account for a portion of the limestone cap that had been there 2 weeks ago was simply absent. Whether fallen or buried, she couldn't determine yet. She turned and looked down toward the valley. Hollowstone Crossing was there. She could see the buildings, or most of them. The hotel was there. The feed store. The brick town hall. But the geography between them was transformed. The familiar street grid buried under drifts that had created an entirely new landscape, soft-edged and deceptive, covering everything with the particular innocence that snow uses to hide the damage underneath. Several rooflines were wrong. She couldn't tell from this distance which ones had failed under the weight, which had lost sections to wind, and which just looked different because the snow around them had changed their context. But the wrongness was visible even from here. Bram came out behind her. She heard him stop. She didn't look at him immediately. She gave him the moment he needed to take in the valley, below specifically the northern reach of it, where his pasture lay. From this elevation, she could see the fence line of the northern field, or what remained of it, the posts knocked sideways and the wire buried. The ground out there was not the undifferentiated white of the sheltered areas. It was broken up, irregular shapes in the snow. She knew what those shapes were. She thought Bram knew too, because he made a sound she'd never heard from him before, not a word, not quite, and went silent. She looked at him then. His face had done something complicated and private, and she looked away to give it back to him. "I'll get Silas," she said quietly, and went back inside. Silas was up and pulling on his second boot when she came in. He looked at her face and read it the way people read faces when they've been confined with someone long enough to understand their expressions without explanation. "How bad?" he said. "The town looks mostly standing," she said. Roof lines I can't evaluate from here. The northern pasture, she stopped. He closed his eyes briefly. Right, he said. Right. The goats came out in stages. Margaret first with her characteristic dignity, then the others in a loose stream. They moved into the snow with immediate purposeful sniffing, ears and noses, working to reassemble to their understanding of the world. Pepper promptly put his front hooves through a drift crust and fell through to his chest, scrambled wildly, and managed to extricate himself with an expression of profound personal offense. Under other circumstances, she might have laughed. The walk down to Hollowstone Crossing took 40 minutes, which was 20 minutes longer than it normally took, because the road was not a road anymore. It was a suggestion, a general direction implied by the fence posts on either side that were still standing, and navigating it required constant adjustment, stepping up onto drift surfaces that might hold weight and might not, finding the packed ground underneath when they didn't. She went first, testing, and Silas came behind her, and Bram brought up the rear, and the 12 goats inserted themselves throughout the procession at whatever position suited them individually. She could hear the town before she could fully see its voices, the sound of digging, someone calling out across a distance. The sounds of people in the aftermath of something large, doing the arithmetic of what remained. They came around the last curve of the buried road, and Hollowstone Crossing opened up before them. The scale of it stopped her for a moment. She'd seen the roof lines from the hill, registered the wrongness of them, but standing at street level now, she could see the specifics. The Morrison barn, which Silas had mentioned, was gone its walls, standing to about 4 feet, but the roof entirely collapsed inward, a heap of snow-covered timber that bore no relationship to the structure it had been. 2 buildings on the north end of the main street had lost their front walls not partially, but entirely, the way a dollhouse loses its facade, the interiors exposed to the sky, the furniture inside still in place, dusted white. The hotel windows that had gone were now boarded with whatever wood had been available. One of them with a section of a door that didn't fit the frame and had been wedged in at an angle. People were working. That was the first thing she clocked. Not huddled, not incapacitated working. Men with shovels clearing paths between buildings. 2 women passing buckets of snow from one place to another in the particular rhythm of people who've been doing a task for a long time. A group of older boys dragging timber sections away from the collapsed barn. But the town hall was where people were gathered most densely. She could see, even from 100 yards, that something was happening there, movement at the doorway, people going in and out with the purposeful urgency of a place that had become something other than a meeting hall. She went toward it. The goats came with her, which was not a decision she made, consciously so much as something that happened, because 12 goats that have spent 2 days in close proximity to you tend to follow you the way water follows a slope. The man she encountered first was a stranger to her, a young fellow with a beard that ice had turned partially white, who looked at her with an expression that progressed through surprise, recognition, and something like relief in about 2 seconds. "Miss Pike, you made it." "Yes," she said. "What's the situation in the town hall?" "Families," he said. "People whose houses didn't—" He gestured vaguely at the missing walls, the collapsed barn. "We moved them in last night. Mayor Hedges organized it. The fuel's nearly gone, and we've had—" He looked at the goats suddenly, really looked at them. "Are those—" "Yes," she said. "How many people inside?" 40, maybe 50. Some children. Old Carl Brannick, he's not doing well. We think the cold got into him before we found him. A couple of others." She thought about Carl Brannick, the man who'd told her he'd been managing winters since before she was born. Thought about the specific stubbornness of people who have survived many things, and how that same stubbornness can make them miss the one thing that finally goes wrong. "I need to get inside," she said. The young man stepped back. She pushed the town hall door open and walked in with 12 goats at her back. Smell hit her first. Too many people in an enclosed space without adequate ventilation, wood smoke, unwashed clothing, the particular medicinal smell of people who have been cold for too long. The light was dim, 2 lanterns burning, both low, the windows boarded against the cold so that what light came in was filtered through gaps in the boarding. People were everywhere. Families in clusters against the walls, children wrapped in coats and blankets, older residents sitting in chairs that had been brought from various locations. The floor was covered with bedding assembled from whatever was available. The room went quiet in the way. Rooms go quiet when something unexpected enters. She was aware of what she looked like, a large woman in a heavy coat with frost on her collar and mud on her boots, walking into this space with a procession of 12 goats. She was aware that she was not what these people expected, was perhaps not what anyone expected in this or any other situation. She looked around the room. Ada Hartley was in the far corner with her 3 children. She met Elowen's eyes across the space, and her expression said, "I listened, and my children are alive, and I know that." Elowen nodded once. "The fuel situation," she said, loudly enough to carry without shouting, addressing the room in general. "What's left?" A moment of uncertain quiet. Then a man near the far wall hedges, the mayor, a solid-bodied man in his 50s whom she'd only spoken to twice, but who had always struck her as practically minded, said, "Half a cord of wood, maybe less. We've been burning through it fast with this many people. You won't need to burn through it the same way anymore," she said. She stepped aside, and the goats came further into the room. These animals put out sustained body heat. Bring them toward the people who are coldest. The room absorbed this. Then a woman near the front said, with a practical directness that Elowen liked immediately, "Are they milking?" "7 of them are," Elowen said. "We can start with the children." What followed was not elegant. It was not organized in the way that competent relief efforts in stories tend to be organized, with everyone understanding their role and executing it smoothly. It was messy and uncertain, and it took time to get the goats positioned in a way that was useful without creating chaos. Because goats in an enclosed space with 50 anxious humans have opinions about the arrangement that they express in ways that are difficult to argue with. Pepper knocked over a lantern. She caught it, and one of the younger does attempted to eat a child's hat while the child was wearing it. Margaret positioned herself in the center of a cluster of elderly residents with the serene authority of someone who has decided where she is most needed and intends to stay there. Bram came in behind her. She'd half forgotten he was there. The walk into town had been focused entirely on what lay ahead, and he'd been quiet, which was its own adjustment. Now he came through the door, and the room registered him with a different kind of attention than it had given her. Bram Calder was the most recognizable person in this valley, the one whose presence always reorganized a room. She watched it happen now, but differently. The reorganization wasn't toward deference or performance. It was something closer to surprise. The most powerful man in the valley, standing behind the widow from the hill. He looked around the room, then he looked at her. "What do you need?" he said. "Not what can I do, not let me help, just what do you need?" Specific. Awaiting instruction. She felt the weight of that sentence more than she let show. "Wood," she said. "Whatever's left outside that can be safely reached." Most of its windows were dark and stacked near the east wall. "And check the ventilation situation in this building. The windows are boarded, and I need to know if there's any airflow or if we're sealed." He turned and went without another word. Silas had already found himself a role. He was talking to Hedges near the front of the room. The two of them bent over something, a list or a plan, or some accounting of what had been used and what remained. She could see Silas' particular blend of remorse and practicality reasserting itself in the efficient way he moved through the space, making himself useful with the specific energy of someone trying to convert guilt into action. She went to Carl Brannick. He was in the corner, propped against the wall, in a chair someone had dragged there, a coat over his lap, and 2 more on top of it. He was awake, which was good. His color was bad, which was not good, a grayish pallor that she recognized from stories her father had told, the color of bodies that have spent too long at the wrong temperature. Crouched in front of him. "Carl," she said. He opened his eyes. They were clear, which was the best sign available. "Pike," he said. His voice was rough but recognizable. "How are your hands?" she said. He lifted one from under the coat. She took it gently and assessed it the way her father had taught her. Color, temperature, the person's response when she pressed along the fingers. He winced at the pressure on the outer 2 fingers of the right hand, which told her about the extent of the cold damage. "You didn't bring your wood inside," she said. "Couldn't get the damn door open," he said with a remnant of his usual stubbornness. "Froze solid before I got to it." She felt a complicated blend of relief and exhaustion. Not his fault then, or not entirely. The specific misfortune of someone who had tried and been defeated by physics, before the human question of stubbornness was even relevant. Stay warm, she said. Don't let them move you to the floor. Stay in the chair, it's off the cold ground. And keep your hands under the coats. You going to lecture me? He said. I already did, she said. 2 weeks ago, you ignored it. A pause. Something shifted in his face, the stubborn set of it softening just slightly, the way old things soften not from weakness, but from wear. I know, he said. I know I did. She stood up, put her hand briefly on his shoulder, not the gesture of a daughter or a nurse, just the pressure of one person acknowledging another. Then she moved on, because there were 48 other people in this room, and she had not yet found all the problems. The milking was done by Ada Hartley, who it turned out had grown up on a farm and had a practiced efficiency with animals that made Elowen's own competence look theoretical. She moved through the milking does with a calm authority that settled the animals, and the children drank in the order she established: youngest first, then older children, then the elderly, with the particular seriousness of hungry people receiving something they need. A small girl, maybe 4 years old, drank half a tin cup of warm goat milk, and then pressed her face against the nearest available goat. It was Margaret, who absorbed this with perfect equanimity and stayed there with her eyes closed. Elowen watched this from across the room and felt something move through her that she didn't have an exact name for. Not happiness exactly. Something more complicated and more durable, the feeling of something working the way it was supposed to work, of a calculation proving correct under real conditions rather than theoretical ones. Bram had organized 4 men and they were moving wood. He'd found with some effort that the building did have a ventilation gap, a poorly fitted section of the north wall, where 2 boards had warped and left a thin gap she could fit 2 fingers through. It was not ideal, but it was sufficient, and she left it, rather than sealing it, because sealed rooms were the problem she'd spent 2 weeks trying to prevent people from creating. She pulled Bram aside briefly. The wood, she said quietly. How much did you find? More than hedges, that he said. Some of the debris from the Morrison barn is still combustible. The men are pulling boards that didn't get waterlogged. It's rough burning, but it's burning. Good, she said. Also, he hesitated, which she hadn't seen him do before, a genuine pause of someone managing something. Old Anders kept a half-load of coal in a sealed shed behind his property. The shed held. Silas is organizing getting it moved. She looked at him. How do you know about Anders's coal shed? I helped him build it 6 years ago, he said. I'd forgotten until just now. She noted the particular quality of that 6 years of forgotten information surfacing at the moment it was most useful, the slow return of something his mind had catalogued and set aside. That's very good, she said. That changes the fuel situation considerably. He nodded. Dupteentop een heen. Looked at her with an expression that had been developing since the shelter, something measured and careful that was clearly trying to say something it hadn't yet found the shape for. She waited. You went to 8 houses, he said, before the storm. Silas told me. You went around warning people. Yes, she said. You didn't come to mine, he said. I came to you at the feed store, she said. You told me your man said hard cold spell, not unusual. I know what I said. A pause. I meant the morning before it hit. You went to 8 houses. You didn't come to mine. She looked at him steadily. No, she said. I didn't. Because you knew I wouldn't listen. Because you'd already made that clear, she said. And I had a limited amount of time, and I used it on people who might. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it the specific way it landed, not as accusation but as fact, which is sometimes harder to receive than accusation, because accusation gives you something to push against. That's fair, he said at last. Yes, she said, it is. She turned back to the room. The temperature had shifted visibly in the past hour. Not dramatically, she was not going to pretend the goats were magical. They were 12 animals doing what 12 animals do, which was to exist at a consistent temperature and warm the air immediately around them, but measurably. People who had been hunched were sitting more upright. A child who had been crying quietly had stopped. Old Carl Brannick had fallen asleep, which was the best thing he could do, his breathing steadier than it had been when she'd crouched in front of him. The Anders coal arrived in the early afternoon, carried in 4 trips by men who'd dug out the shed and moved the load by hand, because there was no other way. When the first piece went into the town hall stove, the crackle of it hotter, longer burning than the wood produced a sound from the assembled room that wasn't quite a cheer, but was in that register. She sat down for the first time in what felt like days. sat on the floor near Margaret, who shifted sideways to allow her the space with the resigned tolerance of someone long accustomed to sharing. Elowen pressed her back against the wall and felt the combined warmth of the room and the coal and 12 goats and 49 human bodies, and let herself be still for a minute. Her hands were shaking slightly. She hadn't noticed until now. That happened sometimes when sustained adrenaline drained away. Her father had told her about it, the tremor that comes after, the body's accounting of what it's been through. She laced her fingers together in her lap and waited for it to pass. Ada Hartley came and sat beside her without asking. She had the baby on her hip again, the baby's face round and pink and deeply unconcerned with the recent catastrophe. "Your goats," Ada said. "Yes," Elowen said. "I've been underestimating goats," Ada said. "Most people have," Elowen said. A comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who have moved past the social formalities and into the simpler territory of shared situation. "Pettifers are here," Ada said. "They're fine." Tom Pettifer's knee held up. He'd stored most of the firewood already inside the week before. Didn't know why he'd done it. Just felt right. A pause. "He didn't know you'd spoken to his wife." "She didn't tell him? She said he wouldn't have listened if she had," Ada said. "So she just did it herself." A short silence. Women in this valley have been translating information into action for a long time without getting credit for the translation. Elowen looked at her. Ada was looking straight ahead at the room, her expression tantrum and almost thoughtful, the expression of someone stating a long-established fact rather than a complaint. "Yes," Elowen said. "They have." Bram was on the far side of the room, talking to Mayor Hedges and two other men she recognized as the valley's larger landowners. She watched the conversation from across the space, not its content. She couldn't hear it, but its shape. The way Hedges kept glancing toward her as Bram talked. The way the other men followed Hedges's glance. The way Bram held himself differently than she had ever seen him hold himself less expansive. The habitual confidence compressed into something more contained, like a man renegotiating his understanding of a space he'd previously thought he knew perfectly. He caught her looking. He didn't look away. He held the look for a moment, then returned to the conversation with Hedges without expression. Turned back to the room. The afternoon moved slowly, the way afternoons move when the crisis is past its acute phase. And what remains is the long work of maintenance and assessment. She went from group to group, checking the cold-related injuries she could identify, giving practical advice where she had it keep moving the fingers. Don't put frozen skin against direct heat. Eat even if you don't feel hungry because your body needs fuel to stay warm. She was not a doctor, and she said so clearly every time, but she knew what she knew from a childhood in a mining community, where medical help was often days away, and practical knowledge was what you had. Most of its windows were dark. The man she'd been most worried about was a young father named Del Morse, whose ears had a blistered appearance, consistent with significant cold exposure. She sent Silas to find whatever butter or grease he could, because she'd seen her father treat similar injuries with anything that would keep moisture from leaving the damaged skin, and waited while Silas came back with a small tin of lard from someone's emergency stores. It wasn't ideal. It was what there was. She applied it carefully while Del Morse sat with his teeth set and his jaw tight in the way of a man trying not to make sound in front of his children. "You'll keep the ears," she said quietly, "but you'll need to be careful with them for a few weeks. My wife is going to," he started. Then he laughed, just briefly, a single tired exhalation that became a laugh almost against his will. "She's going to have a lot to say about this." "She's right here, I assume," Elowen said. "In this room. Third corner from the left," he said. "With R2, she looks furious." Elowen glanced that direction. The woman did, in fact, look furious, with the specific fury of a person who has been terrified for an extended period and is now processing the terror as anger because anger is survivable in a way that terror isn't. She also looked absolutely whole, uninjured, with her two children pressed against her on either side. "She looks fine," Elowen said, "which is what matters." He nodded. "Yes," he said quietly, "yes, it is." The light through the boarded windows had shifted toward the thin gold of late afternoon when the room began to change in a specific way. The acute crisis mode, the collective tenseness of people managing emergency was easing, and in the space it left, something else was moving in. Not comfort exactly, not with a third of the town's buildings, structurally compromised, and a winter still ongoing, and the enormous accounting of the storm's damage not yet begun. But a kind of held steadiness, the temperature stable, the fuel situation managed, children fed, the worst injuries identified and addressed. Mayor Hedges made his way to her. He was a man who chose his words with the care of someone who learned early that words have consequences in public life. He stood in front of her with his hands clasped behind his back and looked at her for a moment before he spoke. "I owe you a candid statement," he said. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I do," he said. "I knew you were going door to door before the storm. I heard it from 3 different people. I didn't go to the 4th and 5th and 6th house myself. I could have. I have the authority in this town to declare a preparation order, tell people what to store, where to shelter. I didn't do it because I didn't—" He stopped, "because I didn't take the warning seriously enough to act on it officially." She waited. "I'll take it more seriously going forward," he said. It was not an apology exactly. It was a commitment, which she thought was worth considerably more. "Good," she said. "Calder tells me." He paused. "He tells me your shelter design is what kept the 3 of you alive, and that without it, he wouldn't have made it through the first night." "That's probably true," she said. He nodded. "The council is going to want to talk about community preparedness," he said. "When things are more settled, we've needed a conversation about it for years, and now we have reason we can't ignore." "I know," she said. "Would you be willing to be part of that conversation?" She looked at him, looked around the room at the families along the walls, at the goats distributed among them, at Silas tallying supplies with Bram at his shoulder, at Ada Hartley with her children and the borrowed competence she'd brought to the milking, Carl Brannock asleep in his chair with Margaret's chin on his knee. The old goat had decided that Carl Brannock needed her specifically and had positioned herself there with the immovable authority she brought to all her decisions. Elwyn thought about Thomas, the way he'd listened to her on the train, the way listening had led to believing, and believing had led west, and west had led to a limestone hill that was now, against all reasonable expectation, the reason 49 people were alive and warm in a town hall in November. "Yes," she said to Hedges, "I'll be part of the conversation." He nodded, started to turn away, "But," she said. He stopped. "The conversation includes the ventilation problem," she said. "Root cellars, sealed rooms, any underground structure in this valley. There are people in this room who didn't know that a sealed space uses up breathable air. That's a knowledge gap that kills people, and it needs to be fixed before next winter." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. "Agreed," he said. She turned back to the room. Across the space, Bram Calder was watching her. He'd been watching the exchange with Hedges. She could tell from his position. He held her look when she turned, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He gave her a single nod. Not the public nod of social acknowledgement, the smaller private version. The nod that means, "I saw that, and I understand what it means." She turned away. Outside, the afternoon was going cold again, with the ordinary cold of a November evening. Nothing like the catastrophe of the past 2 days. Just winter doing its ordinary work. The snow would be there for months. The damage to the valley would take all of spring and into summer to fully assess and address. Bram's northern cattle she had not made herself count. The shapes she'd seen in the pasture snow, but she understood the arithmetic were a loss that would reshape his operation in ways he was only beginning to calculate. And yet, she looked around at 49 people, 3 of them hers to account for, and the rest of them alive in ways they might not have been. She looked at 12 goats doing their unassuming thermal work simply by existing in the room. She looked at the coal burning, clean and hot in the stove that Margaret Calder had stoked 3 hours ago without being asked. The strange, persistent math of preparation. You put in the work before the emergency, and the emergency becomes survivable. You ignore the work, and the emergency shows you exactly what you failed to account for. It wasn't a complicated lesson. It was just hard to learn without the storm forcing you to it. She picked up her notebook from the floor where she'd set it and wrote the day's final entry. Temperature stable, fuel adequate for 48 hours, 49 residents present and accounted for, cold injuries identified and managed, situation accessible. Then she wrote, all 12 goats present and in good health. She underlined it once. It seemed important to note. The first week after the storm was the ugliest kind of work. Not dangerous anymore. The temperature had climbed back to a survivable range. The wind had settled into ordinary winter behavior, and the immediate crisis of frozen people in insufficient shelter had passed. But ugly in the way that aftermath always is, when the emergency is over and what remains is the full accounting of the damage, which is always worse when you can see all of it at once than it was when you were managing it 1 hour at a time. Eloise spent the first 3 days inside the town hall because that was where the work was. Not because anyone formally asked her to stay. Mayor Hedges had said his piece, and Bram had said his, and after that, the town had simply reorganized itself around the practical reality that she knew things that needed to be known and was willing to say them plainly. People came to her with questions the way water finds the lowest point in a landscape, not by decision, just by gravity. The cold injuries needed the most immediate attention. Delmorce's ears were healing with the lard treatment, and which she acknowledged was improvised and imperfect and would benefit from actual medical attention as soon as it was possible to reach Neckbeck-Stemmitz, the next settlement, 2 days' ride south. Carl Brannick's fingers were the more serious problem. The out 2 fingers of his right hand had sustained damage that she recognized from her father's descriptions of frostbite cases in the mining community, as deep enough to be concerning. She didn't tell Carl what she suspected because Carl Brannick was a man who would benefit from hope right now more than accurate prognosis, and because she genuinely didn't know she was not as a doctor, had never claimed to be, and the human body's capacity for either recovery or failure was beyond her ability to predict with confidence. What she told him was, keep them warm, keep them moving gently, eat regularly, and stop being stubborn about accepting help. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been reduced by events to a more honest version of himself. You're a difficult woman, he said. Yes, she said. I've been told. I mean that as a compliment, he said. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. Thank you. On the 4th day, she went back to her hill. She needed to assess the shelter, and she needed, if she was honest with herself, to be alone for a few hours in a space that was hers. The town hall had the particular exhausting quality of any place where many people are managing collective crisis, the low-grade noise of it, the constant presence of other people's needs, the way a large group in a small space turns the air into something you breathe rather than something you move through. She loved the shelter with a specificity that surprised her sometimes. She had built it with her own hands out of a hill that nobody wanted, and it had done exactly what she'd designed it to do, and that quiet fact meant more to her than she had words for. The hill looked different under snow. The quiet of unders upper. She had to dig 3 feet of door drift away before she could open it, working with the short-handled shovel she'd left outside specifically for this possibility. Inside, the chamber was intact. Cold the goats had been absent for 4 days, and the temperature had dropped significantly but structurally perfect. The ventilation shaft was partially re-iced, and she ran the clearing pole through it twice until airflow returned. The supplies she'd left were undisturbed. The thermometer on the wall read 31 degrees, which was below freezing, but only just, and confirmed that the 6 feet of earth above her was doing its insulating work even without the goat heat to supplement it. She sat in the cold chamber for a while, not doing anything productive, just sitting. Her father used to do this, sit in the mine before the shift started, in the dark with just a candle, getting himself oriented to the space. He'd told her it wasn't about calm exactly. It was about honesty, being in the real place rather than your idea of the place. Letting the actual conditions register before you started making plans based on assumptions. She sat with the actual conditions. The chamber was 31 degrees and smelled of goats and cedar and the particular mineral smell of worked limestone. The ventilation shaft was making a soft sound in the cross breeze. The supply bags were slightly depleted but substantially intact. The door seal had held through the worst storm the valley had seen in living memory. She was alive. 12 goats were alive. 2 men who had laughed at this place were alive because of it. She pressed her hand flat against the stone floor, the same gesture she'd made the night before the storm. She didn't say anything this time. Some things don't need words when you're alone with them. She went back to town. The reckoning of the storm's damage took the full first week to compile, and what emerged from that accounting was a picture that nobody in Hollowstone Crossing had quite the frame for because nothing comparable had happened in the valley's recent history. 40% of the working barns had sustained significant structural damage. The Morrison barn was a total loss. 6 houses had lost sections of roof or wall and were uninhabitable until spring repairs could be made. Roads throughout the valley were effectively impassable for anything wheeled until the snow compacted or melted, which at current temperatures would be weeks. And the cattle. Bram went to his northern pasture on the 5th day with 3 of his remaining ranch hands. Eowyn did not go with him because he didn't ask her to, and because it was not her loss to witness. She'd seen enough of it from the hill's elevation, the shapes in the snow, that didn't resolve into anything you wanted to name to understand the scale. He came back in the late afternoon and went directly to the town hall, where Silas was still coordinating supply distribution. Eowyn was in the corner, working through an inventory of what remained in the community stores when she heard him come in. She looked up at his face. He'd aged in the past 5 days in a specific way that had nothing to do with years. Not broken. Bram Calder was not the kind of man who broke. She'd understood that from the beginning, but altered. Something that had been set at a particular tension for so long he hadn't noticed it was there had released. And the face that remained was more tired and more real than the one she'd encountered outside the feed store 2 months ago. 212, he said to the room in general, not dramatically, just stating the number. The room got quiet. Silas set down what he was holding. Out of 308, Bram said. I had moved about 40 to the southern field the week before. Those survived. The ones in the north, he stopped. 212. Eowyn did the arithmetic without wanting to. 212 cattle was not just a number. It was the core of his operation, the capital he'd spent 30 years building, the foundation of his position in the valley, not just socially, but practically, the productive base of everything he owned. She thought about what it would take to rebuild from that. The years, the compounding of losses, hides, milk production, calving seasons that weren't going to happen. She thought about 12 goats she'd bought for $7 because nobody else wanted them. She did not feel satisfaction at the contrast. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. There was no satisfaction in this. There was only the terrible waste of it, the animals, the years of work, the fact that it might have been different if the warning had landed differently, if the conversation outside the feed store had gone another way, if any number of small things had shifted. She was not a person who believed in clean lessons. The storm had not been a lesson. It had been a disaster with survivable and unsurvivable elements distributed according to preparation and weather patterns and a certain amount of pure chance. She went to him, not to say anything profound, just to stand near him, the way you stand near someone who is in the middle of something large and doesn't need advice. What can be salvaged, she asked. Practical. Present. He looked at her. The look had a directness it hadn't carried before the storm 2 days underground together, had dissolved some intermediate layer between them. Some of the hides, maybe 40%. A pause. The southern herd is intact. 39 head. Enough to start from. He said it without conviction, the words of a man who knows the arithmetic is survivable but hasn't yet convinced himself to be glad about it. 39 is enough, she said. It'll take years. Yes, she said, it will. He looked at her, slightly surprised by her not following that with reassurance. But she didn't have reassurance that was honest, and she'd decided years ago that dishonest reassurance was a specific kind of unkindness that she didn't want to practice. The goats, he said after a moment. Your Rocky Hill. The things nobody thought were worth anything. Yes, she said. How many do you have now? After all, she said. Same 12. But 4 of the does are likely pregnant, so by spring. More, he said. More, she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with a difficulty that was visible but not performed, I've been thinking about what I said. At the feed store. The day you brought them in. She waited. The comment I made, he said. About you. He couldn't quite get to the words which she thought was fair. Some things are hard to name when you're the one who said them. It was a poor way to speak to a person. She looked at him. He held the look without deflecting. Yes, she said. It was. I'm sorry for it, he said. Not a performance. Not public. There was no audience for this exchange. They were in the corner of a room full of people attending to other things. Just 2 people in the aftermath of a storm, one of them acknowledging something that needed acknowledging. She held it for a moment. The apology, the real version of it, did something to the weight she'd been carrying since that day. Outside the feed store, not dissolved it, not erased the original moment, but shifted it slightly. She thought about the heat she'd felt moving up the back of her neck. 2 ranch hands laughing. The man across the street turning to look. I accept that, she said. Not it's fine. It's forgotten. Don't worry about it. Just, I accept it, which is different, which acknowledges that it happened and is real, and also that it doesn't define what comes next. He nodded once. The small private version, the same one from across the room the day before. They returned to the inventory. The council meeting happened on the 9th day after the storm in the town hall, which had become by that point the de facto center of Valley operations. It was not a formal proceeding. There wasn't the energy for formality. And Elowen suspected that the informality was actually useful, that people said more honest things when they weren't performing official process. Mayor Hedges ran it. The Valley's significant landowners were present, Bram included. Silas was there, and Ada Hartley, who had been asked specifically because she'd organized the East Side family responses before the storm with a competence that several people had noticed. And Elowen. She sat in a chair against the wall initially, half expecting to be present but peripheral. Old habit. The expectation of a certain kind of meeting where you're in the room but not quite in the conversation. It took about 15 minutes for that to become clearly wrong. Hedges opened with the damage assessment, which was comprehensive and grim, and confirmed what everyone already knew with the authority of numbers written down. He moved through structural losses, livestock losses, the road situation, the fuel situation. He talked about what had been available and what had run out and what the gap between those things had cost in terms of human suffering and injury. Then he said, "We need to talk about next winter." The room took a breath. Not a literal collective breath. People didn't coordinate the moment. But there was a palpable shift in the quality of attention, the way attention sharpens when a conversation moves from accounting the past to addressing the future. Question on the table, Hedges said, is what this valley does differently. Because what we did this year was not sufficient. One of the landowners, a man named Garvey, who ran sheep on the valley's eastern slope, said, "We build better barns, reinforced structures." That helps, Hedges said carefully. But stronger barns don't address the people who couldn't get to them. Better weather forecasting, said another. Better forecasting, Hedges agreed, tells you it's coming. It doesn't tell you how to survive it after it arrives. The conversation moved through several of these exchanges, each one partially correct and partially insufficient, and Elephant listened and tracked where the gaps were in each proposal, the way her father had taught her to track the weak points in a tunnel system, not to diminish the thinking, but to understand where it needed reinforcing. Then Hedges looked at her directly. "Elowen," he said. "You've been quiet." "I've been listening," she said. "We'd benefit from what you're thinking," he said. She looked around the room. At Garvey and the other landowners, at Silas with his remorseful diligence, at Ada Hartley with her clear-eyed practicality, at Bram sitting with his hands clasped and his eyes on her with an expression of straightforward attention. She thought about what to say and decided to say the true thing rather than the diplomatic thing. Because the diplomatic thing had a way of taking 3 times as long to get where it was going. Problem, she said, is not that the town lacks resources or intelligence. The problem is that the town distributes knowledge badly. She paused. Josiah Terrell knew this storm was coming, he told me. I told 8 families and both of you. She glanced at Bram and Silas in the week before it hit. Josiah had that knowledge from 40 years of watching this valley's weather. Nobody had a formal way to get it from him to the people who needed it. She let that sit. Similarly, she said, I knew that sealed underground spaces consume breathable air because my father was a coal miner. That's not complicated knowledge. It's not rare knowledge. But 3 people in this room didn't know it and could have died because of that gap. She looked at Garvey. Better barns are useful. But what this valley actually needs is a system for collecting what people know and making sure that knowledge reaches everyone before the emergency rather than during it. The room was quiet. What does that look like? Hedges asked. It looks like talking to Josiah Terrell before winter and writing down what he observes about the sky and the birds and the animal behavior, she said. It looks like a community shelter that can hold people and animals together, built on the principles I used on my hill underground, ventilated, designed rather than improvised. It looks like someone, not me specifically, anyone who's willing going to every household in August and making sure they know how to prepare for a sealed space, how much fuel they actually need for a 2-week storm rather than a 2-day one, and where to go if their structure fails. And who does all of this? Garvey said, not hostile, just practical. That's a legitimate question, she said. It needs to be organized, and it needs authority behind it. Mayor Hedges can provide the authority. The knowledge needs to come from the people who have at Josiah, anyone else with deep experience of this valley's patterns. She paused. The construction of a community shelter needs someone who understands the underground principles. Another pause. That would be you, Hedges said. That would be me, she said. The meeting went on for another 2 hours and resolved into a set of practical commitments that Silas wrote down in his best handwriting on a clean page because somebody needed to, and he decided that somebody might as well be him given that he'd spent several weeks underutilizing his capacity for useful action. The commitments were not elegant. They were the product of 17 people with different interests and levels of investment, arguing towards something they could all accept, but they were real. Community shelter to be designed and supervised by Elowen Pike, construction to begin in late spring when the ground was workable. A winter preparation protocol to be developed before next autumn. A weather observation system drawing on the knowledge of Josiah Terrell and anyone else in the valley with comparable expertise. And a ventilation requirement. This was Elowen's, and she held firm on it, and nobody pushed back. Once she explained clearly what the alternative was for any underground or sealed structure in the to have an inspectable airflow system before next winter. When the meeting ended, people filed out into the afternoon. The snow outside had softened under 2 days of above-freezing temperatures. It was still deep, still the governing condition of all movement in the valley, but it had lost its lethality. It was just winter now. Winter was manageable. Bram caught up with her on the steps. The shelter, he said. The community one. What will you need? She looked at him. Are you offering resources? I'm asking what you need, he said, which is a different question. She thought about it. Cedar for the framing. Enough rope and iron hardware to build a door that can be opened from inside. I'll need help with the heavy stone work. I can design the ventilation shaft, but I can't lift the cap stones alone. She paused. And someone who won't second-guess the design every time it doesn't look like what they expected. He looked at her for a moment. I can provide the first 3 things, he said. The 4th one I can't promise, but I'll try. That's honest, she said. I've been trying to be more of that, he said, with a dryness that was the first thing she'd heard from him, that was genuinely self-aware, that didn't have the defensive shell around it. She almost smiled. Almost the Rocky Hill principle, she said. You're 39 cattle. Come spring, goats and cattle aren't competing for the same terrain. If you're rebuilding on a smaller base, diversifying makes mathematical sense. He looked at her. Are you suggesting I buy goats? I'm suggesting that terrain your cattle can't use might support animals that can, she said, which reduces your dependence on the northern pasture, which is your highest exposure point in a storm event. A pause. But you can think whatever you like about the rest. She used his own words back at him without emphasis, just said them. He recognized them. His expression shifted through several things in quick succession, none of which she tried to name. I'll think about it, he said. Good, she said. She walked home to her hill. The ascent was harder than it had been in the fall. The snow had compacted and then partially thawed a foot and then refrozen a sequence that made the surface unpredictable. Some sections firm enough to walk on and others that broke through to her knee with no warning. She fell once going down on her hands and one knee and stayed there for a moment in the ridiculous position of a person who has fallen in the snow and is deciding whether it's worth being angry about it. It wasn't. She got up. The shelter was cold but intact as she'd left it. She got the small burner going and put water on and let the warmth build slowly. The way warmth always builds in this space from the center outward, from the floor upward, patient and cumulative. She brought the 12 goats in from where they'd been grazing, on the south slope, which had south-facing exposure, enough to melt some of the snow and reveal the dormant scrub underneath. and they came in with the particular relief of animals returning to a known space after too long outside. Margaret went to her corner. Elowyn sat cross-legged in the center of the chamber with her notebook on her knees. She wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. Then she sat for a moment before writing anything else, looking at the walls of the space, the raw limestone she'd broken out of this hill with Thomas's pickaxe, the marks of the tool still visible in the stone, the specific record of her own labor embedded in the material of this place. She thought about Thomas. She let herself think about him, which she did less often now than in the first months, not because it hurt less, but because the hurt had changed shape, become something she could carry alongside daily work, rather than something that's stopped her. He would have found everything that had happened in the past week intensely interesting and slightly unbelievable. He would have asked her 17 questions about the ventilation shaft and then gone quiet and nodded in the specific way. He nodded when something she'd explained landed correctly in his understanding. She missed the nod. She missed it specifically and clearly, the way you miss particular things about people rather than just missing the general fact of them. She wrote in the notebook, Community Shelter Design Preliminary Considerations. Then she wrote for 2 hours, covering 4 pages with calculations, diagrams in the margins, lists of materials and their properties, questions she didn't yet have answers to. The community shelter would need to be significantly larger than her own, large enough to hold 50 people and their animals at minimum, which meant different engineering considerations than a personal dugout. The ventilation would need to be multiple shafts rather than one, positioned to account for wind direction variability. The door would need to be accessible from inside in case the exterior became blocked, which meant a different mechanism than the simple crossbar she used. She'd never designed anything for anyone other than herself. The thought sat with her for a moment, not intimidating exactly, but significant. Designing for yourself is a particular kind of work. You know your own tolerances, your own body, your own needs. Designing for 50 other people meant accounting for the full range of those things across all of them, which was a different problem. She wrote, Ask Ada Hartley about the children's specific cold tolerances smallest bodies, lose heat fastest. Shelter design should account for this. She wrote, Check with Josiah on prevailing wind directions in a major storm shaft positioning depends on this. She wrote, Stone versus timber frame for primary structure consult Brannick. When he's recovered, he's been building in this valley for 20 years. She wrote, 2 entrance points minimum, 1 on each face of the hill, so that a blocked primary entrance doesn't seal people inside. That last one she underlined twice. The lamp burned low. She refilled it. She had plenty of oil now. The 4 gallons she'd bought before the storm, plus a half gallon that Silas had pressed on her when she left the town hall, with the expression of a man making a material acknowledgement of a debt he couldn't fully repay. She went on writing. Spring arrived with the particular meanness of springs that follow hard winters cold, holding longer than expected, the snow retreating by inches rather than feet, the mud underneath it carrying the memory of the freeze in a cold, wet persistence that made every through the valley feel like an argument. The damage the storm had left was fully visible now, collapsed structures exposed, fence lines wrecked, the northern pasture carrying the evidence of what had died there in a way that the snow had been mercifully covering, and the thaw was not. Bram organized the northern pasture cleanup himself, with 4 men, over 3 days in early March. She didn't go near it. She had her own work. The community shelter site selection took most of February. She walked every hill in the valley's accessible radius, assessing limestone composition, drainage patterns, soil depth over bedrock, accessibility from the main road for people who might be moving in emergency conditions. She brought Josiah Terrell on 2 of these walks. He moved slowly and said little, but when he spoke it was specific and useful. This face gets the worst wind. That drainage channel would back up in a significant melt. The soil composition on this ridge is different from that one, in ways that affect how it behaves when frozen. She wrote everything down. She chose a site in late February, a southwest-facing slope on a limestone ridge that ran parallel to the main road, about a quarter mile from the nearest cluster of houses, accessible from 3 directions, and sheltered on its north face by the ridge itself. She paced out the dimensions, drove stakes to mark them, and stood inside the staked area for a long time, imagining it built and occupied and functional. Then she went back to town and told Hedges she was ready to start when the ground broke. The ground broke in mid-April. Bram was there with the cedar and the hardware, as promised. He was also there physically, which she hadn't expected. She'd expected to receive the materials and manage the labor with whoever volunteered. Instead, he showed up on the first morning with his 2 remaining ranch hands and said, with the particular brevity of a man who has decided something and doesn't want to discuss it, "We're working." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. "Here's what needs to happen today." Listened to the full explanation of the day's work without interrupting. Then he organized his men and they began. She was not a comfortable project supervisor. This was something she discovered in the first week of construction, and she acknowledged it without excessive self-criticism, because self-criticism was not useful right now. She knew how to do the work herself. She was less natural at explaining it in terms that translated for people with different physical approaches and different assumptions about how underground construction works. She lost patience twice in the first week, once with one of the ranch hands who kept overpacking the ventilation shaft clay, and once with a volunteer from town who was driving stakes at the wrong angle and didn't understand why it mattered. She did not lose patience with Bram. This surprised her slightly. He was, and she would not have predicted this, based on anything she'd known of him before the storm, a good person to work alongside. He had the physical competence of someone who had done hard outdoor labor for 30 years, and she came to understand, a genuine aptitude for understanding structural problems once they were explained to him. He asked questions rather than assuming. When she changed the ventilation shaft from mid-construction, because the limestone had turned out to be harder in one section than her survey had indicated, he listened to the explanation, nodded once, and redirected the other workers without complaining about the lost progress. She'd expected, at some level, that he'd treat her supervision as something to be tolerated, a public courtesy extended and then gradually undermined. He didn't. She didn't tell him she'd expected that. She just filed the discrepancy between expectation and reality in the place where she kept things that required updating. Silas came out twice a week with supplies and updates from town. He'd taken it upon himself to organize the material donations, lumber, hardware, food for the workers, with a thoroughness that she recognized as his version of the same accounting she'd seen Bram doing. Silas Venn would never fully stop being the man who hadn't taken her seriously for too long, but he was becoming, incrementally, someone she could rely on to make himself useful without requiring management. That was enough. That was more than enough. Josiah Terrell visited once, in late April, when the main chamber was roughed in and the first ventilation shaft was complete. He came in the late morning and stood at the chamber entrance for a long time, leaning on his walking stick, looking in. She went and stood beside him. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "It's bigger than yours," he said. "It needs to hold 50 people and their animals," she said, "with ventilation for all of them." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father would have built this," he said. "Different materials, different ground, but the principle." He tapped his walking stick against the limestone. Same principle. She didn't answer, for the same reason she hadn't answered when he'd said her father would be proud. Some things don't need answering. The ones that are true enough stand fine on their own. He left before noon. She watched him go down the slope, his deliberate progress, the same as she'd watched him descend her hill back in November. She didn't know how many more winters Josiah Terrell had in him. He was old in a way that was genuine rather than performed, and this winter had not been easy on him. She'd heard, though he'd survived it without injury. She hoped he had more winters. She wanted to ask him more questions. The shelter was complete by late. May not perfect, not everything she'd have done if time and materials had been unlimited, but complete in the sense that mattered. 2 chambers instead of 1, connected by a short tunnel, each with its own ventilation shaft and its own entrance. Capacity for 60 people and a substantial number of animals. A door mechanism that could be operated from inside by a child if necessary. She'd spent 4 days on that specific problem and was more proud of it than any other single element. Emergency supplies stored in sealed cedar boxes in the inner chamber, dried food, a basic medical kit that doctor. Howson from the southern settlement had helped her compile on his spring visit. The The day they sealed the final entrance, Hedges organized a small gathering, not a celebration exactly, more of an acknowledgement. People came from across the valley, a couple dozen of them, and stood around the finished structure in the May sunshine. He made a short speech about preparedness and community and the lessons of the past winter. It was a decent speech as far as speeches go. Elowin stood at the back and listened and thought about all the places it was slightly wrong, about who had done what and in what order, and decided that the details didn't matter as much as the outcome, and let it be. Then Bram spoke, which she hadn't expected. He stood at the shelter entrance and said, without the rhetorical polish that public men usually employ, I want to say something specific. This shelter exists because Elowin Pike spent the autumn of last year doing work that everyone in this valley, including me, told her was either foolish or pointless. She did it anyway. The northern blizzard killed over 200 of my cattle. It did not kill any of us, and a significant part of that is because of what she built, and what she knew, and what she was willing to say out loud even when nobody listened. Pause. I didn't listen. He said, I'm saying that in public because I said the opposite in public, and the correction deserves the same address. Silence. The specific silence of a crowd that is processing something it didn't expect. Elowin looked at the ground for a moment. Then she looked up. Ada Hartley was watching her from the left side of the group, with her youngest on her hip, expression of a woman who understands exactly what is happening and finds it long overdue. She gave Elowin a small nod. Elowin gave her one back. She didn't make a speech. When Hedges invited her to say something, she said, use it. That's all I want. When the weather turns and the sky looks wrong, bring your people and your animals here and use it. She paused. And check the ventilation every 2 hours. The pole for clearing the shafts is stored in the right side chamber, against the east wall. A few people laughed. Not unkindly. She walked home to her hill. That afternoon she sat outside the entrance to her own shelter, the original. The one she'd built alone with Thomas's pickaxe and $40, and 12 unwanted goats, and looked out over the valley. The May light was the kind of light that makes even damaged things look possible. Long and gold and unglamorous, just honest light doing its work. The valley below had spent the spring accounting for itself. Damaged structures were being repaired, not all of them. Some were simply abandoned, and the road was navigable again. Bram's 39 cattle were visible in the southern pasture, small dark shapes, moving in the unhurried way of animals with adequate space and no immediate threat. 4 of Elowin's does had kidded in March, which meant her herd was no longer 12. It was 17 with 2 more expected. 17 was different from 12. Not just numerically 17 felt like something that had momentum, something in motion rather than something holding still. She was going to need to expand the shelter on the hill to accommodate them, which she was already planning in the back pages of the account book. She was also, she'd realized sometime in the past month, going to need help. Not because she couldn't manage the herd alone, she could. She'd been managing everything alone since Tess died. That was not the question. But because the community shelter needed seasonal maintenance, and the preparation protocol that she and Hedges had designed needed someone to actually go around to the households in August and make sure it was happening, and Josiah Terrell's weather observations needed to be written down by someone he'd actually talked to, and she was already at the edge of what one person could accomplish in the hours of a day. She hadn't figured out what that looked like yet. She'd been thinking about it. Bram rode up the hill that evening just before sunset. She heard the horse before she saw him, and by the time he came around the upper ridge, she'd already identified the specific sound of the gray he'd been riding since his better horse threw him in the storm. He dismounted without ceremony and stood a few feet away, looking out at the same view she'd been looking at. The southern herd, he said. They're settled. I saw them from up here, she said. The 2 youngest calves from last fall made it, he said. I wasn't sure they would. They were undersized. Undersized things sometimes make it, she said. He glanced at her. That's a pointed comment. It's a true comment, she said. Sometimes it's also pointed. He looked back at the valley. The gold light was deepening toward the orange that precedes actual sunset, and the shadows were getting long. The council wants to expand the shelter next year, he said. Hedges wants to discuss it in July, before the August preparation rounds. I know, she said. He wrote to me. He wrote to both of us, Bram said. He wants us both there. She looked at him sideways. Both, he said. Bram paused, with the slight expression of someone quoting something they find accurate but slightly uncomfortable. He said, "You have the knowledge, and I have the capacity to make sure other people show up and listen, and that these are not competing advantages." She thought about that for a moment. It was the most diplomatically phrased thing Hedges had ever said in her presence, and also the most accurate. "Fine," she said. "Fine," he said. The sun reached the ridge behind them, and the light changed in the valley below, the colors cooling, the long shadows merging, the small dark shapes of the cattle moving toward the south fence in the unhurried way of animals following the rhythm of an ordinary evening. Somewhere further down the hill, Margaret made the low sound in her throat that meant she was settling in for the night. Elowen didn't look back at the shelter. She knew it was there. She knew the thermometer on the inside wall was reading whatever it was reading, that the ventilation shaft was open and clear, that the door seal was holding, that the supplies were where she'd put them. She knew all of this without looking, because she'd built it herself, and she trusted the things she'd built. That was a different feeling from certainty. Certainty is a door you close against the unknown. This was more like a foundation, solid enough that you could stand on it and still look out at the horizon and think about what comes next. Bram's horse shifted and blew a soft breath into the cooling air. "Those goats of yours," he said, the idea of goats on the eastern terrain. "Yes," she said. "I've been thinking about it," he said. "I know," she said. "Silas mentioned it." He made a short sound that was almost a laugh. "Of course he did." A pause. "I went and looked at the eastern slope last week. Terrain. And it's rocky and difficult, and I don't know enough about what goats actually need to have a useful opinion yet," he said. "So I'm not going to pretend I do." She looked at him fully for the first time since he'd come up the hill. He wasn't performing anything. He was just standing there in the end-of-day light with his hat in his hand, and his bad knee slightly favored, and his face honest in the way it had been since the shelter, the storm having removed something that probably needed removing. "I could tell you what they need," she said. "I was going to ask," he said. She nodded, looked back at the valley. She thought about the account book, Thomas's handwriting on the early pages alongside hers, prices and distances and observations about terrain. She thought about the page where she'd written that valley, the limestone ridge, in her own hand, and the decision that writing had preceded. She thought about the pickaxe, the first swing, the bounce, the second swing that bit better. She thought about 12 goats that nobody wanted, and a hill that nobody valued, and 2 years of being measured by standards that had nothing to do with what she actually was. The valley below was quieting into evening, the ordinary peace of a place that has something and is now going about the business of surviving the next thing, which is always coming. The northern sky, she noted from habit, the habit she would carry for the rest of her life, was clean. Cold and clear and dark at the edges, but clean. No weight to it. Nothing pressing down. Just the ordinary sky of an ordinary evening in a valley, where people were finally slowly learning to prepare for what it could become. Margaret called again from below, more insistent this time. "I need to go in," Elowen said. "Yes," Bram said. She went down toward the shelter entrance, down the slope she knew by memory in the dark, the limestone ridge solid and unchanged under her feet. Behind her, Bram mounted the gray and turned toward the road. Neither of them said goodbye. It wasn't that kind of ending. She went inside, counted 17 goats, checked the thermometer, and wrote the day's final entry in the account book. Then she set down the pen and let the warmth of the earth and the warmth of 17 breathing animals do their patient work around her, and she closed her eyes in a place she had built with her own hands out of a hill that nobody wanted, and she was not afraid of the north wind. She was ready for it.